Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The humid Florida air hung thick like a wet blanket as Jake Morrison guided his 2018 Kenworth T680 down the desolate stretch of Highway 41 that cuts through the Everglades. It was approaching midnight on a sultry August evening, and the veteran trucker had been hauling produce from Miami to Tampa for the past 6 years. Jake knew this route like the back of his weathered hands. Every curve, every mile marker, every spot where cell service dropped to nothing. At 43 years old, Jake had spent nearly 2 decades behind the wheel of various rigs, but something about this particular night felt different. The normally busy highway was eerily empty, with not a single set of headlights visible in either direction. His cargo of fresh vegetables needed to reach the distribution center by dawn, and he'd made good time so far, maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour despite the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the beam of his headlights. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle vibration through the steering wheel, barely noticeable at first, but gradually increasing in intensity. Jake's experienced hands detected the anomaly immediately, and his eyes darted to the dashboard gauges. Oil pressure normal, temperature steady, but something was definitely wrong. The vibration evolved into a grinding sensation that seemed to emanate from the rear axles, sending an unwelcome chill down his spine despite the muggy heat. 23 miles from the nearest service station, according to his mental map of the route, Jake made the decision to pull over and investigate. The shoulder was narrow here, barely wide enough for his rig, with the dark waters of the Everglades lurking just beyond a thin guardrail. He engaged his hazard lights and carefully brought the massive vehicle to a stop, the air brakes hissing like angry serpents in the night. Stepping down from the cab, Jake was immediately enveloped by the oppressive humidity and the cacophony of nocturnal swamp sounds. Crickets, frogs, and countless other creatures created a wall of noise that seemed almost aggressive in its intensity. He grabbed his flashlight and began his inspection, starting with the drive wheels. What he found made his blood run cold. The inner dual on the passenger side had completely shredded, and the outer tire was showing signs of severe damage. "Damn it all to hell," Jake muttered, realizing he was facing every trucker's nightmare. A breakdown in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. He climbed back into the cab and tried his phone anyway, holding it up in various positions, desperately searching for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The CB radio crackled with static when he tried to raise another driver, the airwaves as empty as the highway. Jake weighed his options carefully. He could attempt to limp along on the damaged tires, risking further damage or a complete blowout that could send him careening into the swamp. Or he could wait here, hoping another vehicle would pass by and offer assistance. The third option, walking to find help, seemed foolish given the isolation and the dangerous wildlife that called the Everglades home. As he sat in the cab contemplating his next move, Jake noticed movement in his side mirror. A figure was approaching from the darkness behind his trailer, moving with an odd, shuffling gait. Relief washed over him initially, thinking help had arrived. But as the figure drew closer, illuminated by the red glow of his trailer lights, Jake felt his relief transform into unease. The man who emerged from the darkness was tall and unnaturally thin, wearing coveralls that might have once been blue, but were now stained with what looked like motor oil and something darker. His face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that reflected the light like a nocturnal animal's. He stopped about 20 feet from Jake's cab and simply stood there, staring. Jake rolled down his window partially. "Hey there, buddy. Having some tire trouble here. You wouldn't happen to have a phone that works out here, would you?" His voice sounded strained even to his own ears. The stranger tilted his head at an uncomfortable angle, like a bird examining potential prey. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy and barely above a whisper. "Trouble finds folks out here regular-like, especially at night. You picked a bad spot to stop, trucker." "Didn't have much choice," Jake replied, his hand instinctively moving toward the tire iron he kept beside his seat. "You from around here?" The man's lips pulled back in what might have been intended as a smile but looked more like a grimace. "My name's Amos. Been living out here longer than you'd believe? That your rig making all that noise earlier?" "Heard it from my place, about a quarter mile back in the marsh." Jake found it hard to believe anyone lived out here, but he'd heard stories of people who'd gone native in the Everglades, living off the grid in ramshackle dwellings. "Yeah, blown tire. Don't suppose you know anyone who could help?" "I'd pay well for assistance." Amos took a step closer, and Jake caught a whiff of something foul, like rotting vegetation mixed with old sweat. "My cousin Vince, he's good with mechanical things. Got a shop of sorts back at our place. Could probably help you out, but..." He paused, his strange eyes scanning the length of Jake's trailer. "What you hauling?" "Just produce." "Vegetables for a supermarket chain," Jake answered, not liking where this conversation was heading. "Vegetables," Amos repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "That's good. Vince'll help you for sure. But you'll need to come with me. Can't bring his tools out here. Too many, too heavy." Every instinct Jake had developed over 2 decades of driving told him this was a bad idea. But what choice did he have? He couldn't sit here all night, and walking alone seemed even more dangerous than going with this strange man. At least if he went willingly, he might maintain some control over the situation. "How far is this place?" Jake asked, his fingers wrapping around the tire iron. "Not far. Maybe 15 minutes walking. Vince'll get you fixed up quick. He's fixed lots of trucks that broke down here." Amos's smile widened, revealing teeth that were surprisingly white and sharp-looking in the dim light. Jake made his decision. He grabbed his phone, wallet, and keys, sliding the tire iron into his belt at the small of his back, hidden by his shirt. He also pocketed a small knife he kept in the cab, then locked the truck carefully. "Lead the way, but I'm warning you. I've got people expecting me in Tampa. If I don't show up, they'll come looking." Amos chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Sure they will, trucker. Sure they will." They left the relative safety of the highway and plunged into the wilderness. There was no visible path, but Amos moved with confident familiarity through the sawgrass and around the cypress trees. The ground grew increasingly soggy, and Jake's boots squelched with each step. The chorus of swamp sounds seemed to intensify, and he could hear splashing in the darkness that suggested large creatures moving through the water. After what felt like much longer than 15 minutes, they arrived at a clearing where several structures stood on stilts above the swamp. They looked like they'd been cobbled together from salvaged materials: corrugated metal, old wood, pieces of vehicles. Dim lights glowed in some of the windows, and Jake could hear the sound of a generator humming somewhere in the darkness. "Vince," Amos called out. "Got a customer for you." A door opened in the largest structure, and another figure emerged. Vince was shorter than Amos, but broader, with thick arms and a barrel chest. Unlike his cousin, he wore relatively clean clothes and had an almost normal appearance, except for his eyes, which held the same predatory gleam. "Truck trouble?" Vince asked, his voice surprisingly cultured compared to Amos's rasp. "What seems to be the problem?" Jake explained about the blown tires, staying alert and keeping his hand near the concealed tire iron. Vince nodded thoughtfully. I can help, but it'll take some doing. Need to get my equipment out there. Won't be cheap, though. These night calls, you understand. How much? Jake asked. Depends on what we find when we get there. Could be you need more than just tires. Could be your axles damaged, bearings shot. Won't know until I take a look. Vince's smile didn't reach his eyes. But first, how about some coffee? You look tired, and it's going to be a long night. Jake wanted to refuse, but his throat was parched from the humid air and stress. Sure, but then we need to get moving. I'm already running late. They entered the main structure, and Jake was surprised to find it relatively well appointed inside. It was cluttered with mechanical equipment and parts, but clean and organized. Vince poured coffee from a pot on a camp stove, and Jake accepted it gratefully, though he only pretended to sip after catching an odd smell from the cup. So, you boys lived out here long? Jake asked, trying to keep the conversation normal while his eyes searched for potential weapons or escape routes. All our lives, Vince replied. Our daddy built this place back in the 70s. We keep to ourselves mostly, but we help folks when they need it, especially truckers. You'd be surprised how many break down along this stretch. Really? Seems like bad luck, all those breakdowns in the same area, Jake observed, watching their reactions carefully. Amos giggled, an unsettling sound from such a gaunt man. Bad luck, yeah, that's what it is. Bad luck. Vince shot his cousin a warning look. Ignore him. Amos isn't quite right in the head. Too much time in the swamp. Now, let me gather my tools and we'll head back to your truck. As Vince moved to another room, Jake noticed something that made his blood freeze. On a shelf near the door were several items that looked distinctly out of place. A row of truckers' logbooks, a collection of CB radios, and what appeared to be multiple commercial driver's licenses spread out like trophies. Jake stood up casually, moving toward the door. Actually, I just remembered I've got a spare in the underbay storage. Should be able to manage on my own. Thanks for the coffee, but I should get going. Vince reappeared in the doorway, blocking his exit. He was holding a large wrench, tapping it against his palm. Now, that's not very neighborly, wanting to leave so sudden-like. We went to all this trouble to help you. I appreciate it, really, but I need to go, Jake said, his hand moving toward the tire iron. See, that's the problem, Vince continued, his friendly demeanor evaporating. You've seen our place now. We can't just let you walk away. Amos, remember what happened to the last one who tried to leave? Amos's giggle turned into full-throated laughter. He didn't get far. The gators saw to that. Jake pulled the tire iron free, holding it defensively. I don't want any trouble. Just let me go and we'll forget this ever happened. Can't do that, Vince said, taking a step forward. You truckers, always thinking you're so tough, so important. But out here, you're just meat. Meat and metal, both valuable in their own ways. The attack came simultaneously from both men. Vince swung the wrench while Amos lunged from the side. Jake's years of loading and unloading heavy cargo had kept him strong, and adrenaline sharpened his reflexes. He parried Vince's swing with the tire iron and drove his elbow into Amos's solar plexus, sending the thin man gasping to the floor. The fight was brutal and desperate. Vince was stronger than he looked, and Amos recovered quickly, grabbing at Jake's legs. Jake fought with the fury of a man who knew his life depended on it, using the tire iron to devastating effect. He caught Vince across the temple, sending him crashing into the shelf of stolen CDLs, then stomped hard on Amos's reaching hand, feeling bones crunch under his boot. Not waiting to see if they'd recover, Jake burst through the door and ran into the swamp. He could hear shouts behind him, and what sounded like an airboat engine starting up. The darkness was absolute away from the structures, and he stumbled through the water and muck, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. He had no idea which direction led back to the highway, but he kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. The sound of the airboat grew closer, its spotlight sweeping through the trees. Jake ducked behind a massive cypress, pressing himself against the bark as the light passed inches from his position. "You can't hide forever, trucker." Vince's voice echoed through the swamp. "We know every inch of this place, every trail, every hiding spot. Make it easy on yourself." Jake waited until the airboat moved past, then continued in what he hoped was the opposite direction. He stumbled through the darkness for what felt like hours, his clothes soaked with swamp water and sweat, his skin covered in scratches and insect bites. Several times he heard splashing that suggested large alligators nearby, but he kept moving, knowing the human predators behind him were the immediate threat. Finally, impossibly, he saw lights through the trees. Not the searching spotlight of the airboat, but the steady glow of highway lights. He stumbled toward them, crashing through the last of the underbrush to emerge on the highway, not far from where his truck sat waiting. He ran to his rig, hands shaking as he unlocked the door and climbed inside. The engine started immediately, and he didn't care about the ruined tires as he pulled back onto the highway, driving on the rims if necessary. He didn't stop until he reached a well-lit truck stop 12 miles down the road, where he immediately called 911. The police response was swift and serious. Jake led them back to the approximate area where he'd left the highway, but despite extensive searching, they could find no trace of the structures he described. The swamp had seemingly swallowed all evidence of Amos and Vince's compound. What they did find, however, were the remains of 3 trucks, stripped and partially submerged in the swamp not far from the highway, their VIN numbers matching vehicles reported missing over the past 2 years. The investigation continued for months, but Amos and Vince were never found. Jake completed his delivery late but intact, and he never drove that stretch of Highway 41 again. He changed routes, changed companies, did whatever it took to avoid the Everglades at night. The other truckers understood. They'd all heard stories, whispered at truck stops and shared over CB radios, about the stretch of road where rigs broke down for no good reason, and drivers sometimes disappeared without a trace. The official police report listed Jake's case as an attempted robbery by unknown suspects, still at large. But Jake knew the truth was darker. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the Everglades, Amos and Vince were still out there, waiting for the next trucker to break down in their territory. He'd been lucky to escape with his life, and he knew it. Jake continued driving for another 3 years before retiring early, the memories of that night haunting him. He'd sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, hearing Amos's unsettling giggle or seeing Vince's predatory smile. The physical scars from his escape through the swamp faded, but the psychological ones remained fresh. He tried to warn other drivers when he could, posting anonymous messages on trucker forums about avoiding night drives through that particular stretch of the Everglades. Some believed him, others dismissed it as another urban legend. But the disappearances continued, 1 or 2 a year, always at night, always in the same general area. The last Jake heard, the authorities were still investigating, following leads that went nowhere, searching for men who seemed to exist only in the darkness of the swamp. He knew they'd never find them. The Everglades kept its secrets, and Amos and Vince had become part of that ancient, hostile landscape. Predators perfectly adapted to their environment. On quiet nights, safe in his home far from Florida, Jake would sometimes think about all the truckers still out there, driving through the darkness, their engines humming, their cargo secure. Completely unaware that somewhere along a lonely stretch of Highway 41, two men waited patiently for the next breakdown, the next victim, the next person to disappear into the humid embrace of the Everglades. He'd tried to put it all behind him, but some experiences burrow too deep to ever fully extract. The fear, raw and primal, had become part of him. He'd survived what others hadn't, escaped where others had likely died, and that knowledge was both a blessing and a curse. He was alive, but he'd never truly left that swamp. Part of him was still there, running through the darkness, hearing the airboat approaching, knowing that death waited in the shadows. Jake eventually stopped driving commercially altogether, taking a job at a local warehouse where he could go home every night to his own bed. His wife noticed the change in him but never pushed for explanations about that night in Florida. She could see it in his eyes sometimes, the lingering terror of a man who'd brushed against something evil and barely lived to tell about it. The trucking community has its share of legends and cautionary tales, stories passed down from driver to driver about dangerous stretches of road and places to avoid. Jake's story became one of them, though the details shifted with each telling. Some versions had him fighting off a dozen men, others had him discovering a mass grave in the swamp. But the core remained the same. Stay away from that stretch of Highway 41 at night, especially if you're alone. Especially if your rig starts having problems. Because somewhere out there, in a place where civilization ends and the primordial swamp begins, Amos and Vince are still waiting. Their compound might be hidden, their methods might be refined, but their purpose remains unchanged. They're the lurking danger that every trucker fears, but few acknowledge. The reason why breakdowns in certain places feel more ominous than mere mechanical failure. Jake Morrison survived his encounter with the Everglades killers, but he knew he was one of the lucky ones. His truck was eventually recovered, repaired, and sold. He never wanted to see it again. Couldn't bear the thought of sitting in that cab where he'd made the fateful decision to follow Amos into the swamp. The insurance company questioned the damage, the missing hours in his logbook, but eventually paid out. They had no category for escaped from murderers in the swamp. Years later, Jake would occasionally check online news from Florida, searching for stories about missing truckers or abandoned rigs found along Highway 41. Every time he found one, he'd wonder if it was them, if Amos and Vince were still operational, still hunting. The not knowing was almost worse than the memory of that night. At least his terror had an ending. For those still missing, their final moments remained a mystery. The Everglades stretch on for miles, a vast wilderness where nature reigns supreme and humans venture at their own risk. It's a place of incredible beauty during the day, teeming with life and unique ecosystems. But at night, it transforms into something else entirely. A dark maze where predators of all kinds hunt their prey. Jake had encountered the most dangerous predators of all that night. Humans who'd adapted to the darkness, who'd made it their domain. His story serves as a warning to all who travel those lonely roads. Trust your instincts, stay with your vehicle, and never, ever follow strangers into the swamp. Because while most breakdowns are just bad luck, and most helpful strangers are genuinely kind, sometimes, in certain places, at certain times, the danger is real, waiting just beyond the reach of your headlights, patient and hungry, and all too human in its evil. The highway has been improved since Jake's encounter, with more emergency call boxes and better cell tower coverage. But the fundamental danger remains. The swamp is still there, vast and impenetrable, hiding secrets that may never fully come to light. And somewhere in that wilderness, two men might still be waiting, watching the highway, listening for the telltale sound of a struggling engine, ready to offer help to the next unlucky trucker who breaks down in their territory. Jake Morrison never returned to Florida after that night, never drove through the Everglades again, but the memory stayed with him, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous miles aren't the ones with ice or fog or steep grades. Sometimes they're the ones that seem peaceful, empty, safe. Sometimes the real danger comes not from the road itself, but from what waits beside it, in the darkness just beyond the shoulder, where civilization ends and something much older and more ruthless begins. His final warning to fellow truckers was always the same. If you break down in the Everglades at night, stay in your cab, lock your doors, and wait for dawn. Don't trust anyone who appears out of nowhere, especially if they want you to leave your truck. The swamp has secrets, and some of them have names like Amos and Vince. I was lucky. You might not be. Cole Patterson had been making the Miami to Key West run for nearly 8 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the overseas highway had to offer. The 51-year-old owner-operator knew every bridge, every potential hazard, every spot where the Atlantic Ocean kissed the Gulf of Mexico. His 2019 Peterbilt 579 was his pride and joy, customized with extra security features that made him a preferred carrier for high-value loads, heading to the luxury resorts and businesses of the Florida Keys. On this particular September evening, Cole was hauling something special. A shipment of rare wines and spirits worth nearly $500,000, destined for a new high-end restaurant opening in Key West. The cargo was temperature-controlled, sealed, and supposedly secret. Only Cole, his dispatcher, and the client were supposed to know about the valuable load. But as he would soon discover, secrets have a way of getting out in the tight-knit world of specialty transport. The sun was setting as Cole crossed the 7-mile bridge, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reflected off the calm waters below. It was the kind of view that reminded him why he loved this route despite its challenges. The 2-lane highway left little room for error, and there were limited places to stop safely, especially with a full-sized rig. But the beauty of the journey usually made up for the stress. As he approached Marathon, Cole decided to pull into a small truck parking area he'd used before, just off the highway near mile marker 50. He needed to check his load, grab a quick meal, and rest for 30 minutes before completing the final stretch to Key West. The lot was mostly empty, just 2 other vehicles. A beat-up pickup truck and a white van with tinted windows that gave him an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite explain. Cole backed his rig into a spot that gave him clear views on all sides and kept the cab facing the exit. 20 years of driving had taught him to always park defensively, especially when carrying valuable cargo. He completed his routine inspection, checking the seal on the trailer, the temperature controls, and the various locks and security devices he'd installed over the years. Everything appeared normal. The small restaurant attached to the parking area was nearly deserted when Cole entered. A tired-looking waitress named Pearl greeted him with the kind of weary smile that suggested she'd been on her feet too long. Cole ordered a Cuban sandwich and black coffee, positioning himself at a corner booth where he could watch his truck through the window. "Haven't seen you in a while," Pearl said as she brought his food. "Still doing the Key West run?" "Every week, sometimes twice," Cole replied, his eyes never leaving his rig. "Business is good." Pearl followed his gaze. "You seem jumpy tonight. Everything okay?" Before Cole could answer, 2 men entered the restaurant. One was tall and muscular, with tattoos covering his arms, wearing a tank top despite the air conditioning. The other was shorter, wiry, with nervous energy that made him seem like he was vibrating even while standing still. They took a booth near the door, positioning themselves where they could watch both Cole and the parking lot. Cole's instincts, honed by years on the road, immediately went on high alert. He'd seen enough trouble in his time to recognize it when it walked through the door. The men ordered coffee but didn't touch it. Their attention focused entirely on him and occasional glances toward his truck. The taller one, who had a crude skull tattoo on his neck, kept checking his phone as if waiting for a message. "Pearl," Cole said quietly when she came to refill his coffee. "You know those guys?" She glanced over and shook her head slightly. "Never seen them before." "They giving you trouble?" "Not yet," Cole muttered, pulling out his phone to text his dispatcher about the situation. But there was no signal, which was unusual for this location. He tried his company's emergency app, but it wouldn't connect either. The coincidence was too convenient to be accidental. The tall man suddenly stood up and walked over to Cole's booth, sliding in across from him without invitation. Up close, Cole could see the man's eyes were bloodshot and slightly unfocused, suggesting he was on something. A faded prison tattoo was partially visible under his collar. "Nice rig you got out there," the man said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl that didn't quite fit with the keys. "Peterbilt, right? What year?" 2019, Cole answered carefully, his hand moving to rest on the knife clipped to his belt. "Something I can help you with?" The man smiled, revealing a gold tooth. "Name's Bruno. Me and my associate, we're in the transportation business too. Wondering what you're hauling that needs all that security. Seems like overkill for a regular load." "Just standard precautions," Cole said. "Insurance company requirements." Bruno leaned forward, his smile fading. "See, that's interesting, because we heard through the grapevine that you're carrying something real special tonight. Something that certain people would pay good money to acquire at a discount, if you know what I mean." Cole stood up slowly, throwing a 20 on the table. "I don't know what you heard, but you heard wrong. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back on the road." Bruno grabbed Cole's wrist as he tried to pass. His grip was strong, fingers digging into Cole's arm hard enough to leave marks. "That's not very friendly. We're just trying to have a conversation here. Maybe work out a deal that benefits everyone." Cole jerked his arm free and headed for the door, but Bruno's partner blocked his path. The shorter man had produced a pistol, holding it low against his leg where Pearl couldn't see it from behind the counter. The threat was clear without words. "Let's take this outside," Bruno suggested, his friendly tone at odds with the menace in his eyes. "Don't want to disturb the nice lady's business." Cole had no choice but to comply. As they exited, he caught Pearl's eye and mouthed, "Call 911, hoping she understood. Outside, the parking lot had taken on an ominous feel in the growing darkness. The lights were dim, casting long shadows between the vehicles. Cole's truck sat silent and waiting, its cargo worth killing for. "Here's how this is going to work," Bruno said, pulling out his own weapon, a compact semi-automatic. "You're going to open that trailer. We're going to transfer the cargo to our van, and then you're going to report it stolen tomorrow morning after we're long gone. Nobody gets hurt. Insurance covers your loss. Everyone wins." "Except my reputation and career are ruined," Cole shot back. "No carrier will trust me after losing a load like this." The shorter man, who still hadn't spoken, moved toward Cole's truck with bolt cutters. Cole knew once they breached his security, it was over. He had to act now or lose everything. "Wait," Cole said, pulling out his keys. "At least let me do it properly. Those locks are expensive, and I'll need them for the police report." Bruno considered this, then nodded. "Smart thinking. But try anything stupid, and we'll take the whole truck with your body in it." Cole walked to his trailer, his mind racing through options. The emergency beacon hidden in his cab would alert authorities, but he needed to reach it without arousing suspicion. As he pretended to fumble with the locks, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Pearl had come outside, and she wasn't alone. A Monroe County Sheriff's deputy was with her, his hand on his service weapon. Bruno saw them too and cursed. "Inside the trailer now," he hissed at Cole, pressing the gun against his ribs. But Cole had been waiting for this moment of distraction. He spun, using his keys as a weapon, raking them across Bruno's face. The man screamed and staggered back, blood streaming from the gouges near his eye. Cole dove toward his cab as the shorter man fired, the bullet sparking off the pavement inches from his feet. The deputy reacted instantly, drawing his weapon and shouting for everyone to freeze. The shorter man panicked and fired at the officer, missing wide but forcing him to take cover. In the chaos, Cole managed to reach his cab and slam the door, immediately hitting the emergency beacon and starting the engine. Bruno was screaming obscenities, his face a mask of blood, firing wildly at Cole's truck. The bulletproof glass Cole had installed as an extra precaution spiderwebbed but held. The shorter man was trying to get to their van, but the deputy had called for backup and sirens were already approaching. Cole threw the truck in gear and pulled forward, not to flee, but to block the van's escape route. Bruno tried to jump onto the running board, but Cole swerved, sending him tumbling onto the asphalt. The shorter man made it to the van and tried to ram Cole's truck, but the massive Peterbilt barely moved from the impact. Within minutes, the parking lot was swarming with law enforcement. Bruno and his partner were on the ground in handcuffs, Bruno still bleeding and cursing. Cole sat in his cab, hands shaking from the adrenaline, watching as order was restored. Detective Ray Morrison from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office took Cole's statement while crime scene technicians processed the area. "You're lucky," the detective said. "These two are connected to a Miami theft ring we've been tracking for months. They've hit 3 other shipments in the Keys this year." "How did they know about my cargo?" Cole asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We're looking into that. Probably someone at either the shipping or receiving end. These operations always have inside information." Morrison paused, studying Cole's truck. "That security glass saved your life. Bruno Castellano isn't known for leaving witnesses." Pearl, who had been giving her own statement, approached them. "I called 911 as soon as you left with them. Told them it was an armed robbery in progress. Deputy Williams was just 2 minutes away." Cole thanked her profusely, knowing her quick thinking had probably saved both his life and his cargo. The wine shipment was intact, though delayed, and Cole had to spend the rest of the night dealing with law enforcement and insurance companies. The investigation that followed revealed a complex theft ring that had infiltrated several shipping companies in South Florida. An employee at Cole's client had been selling information about high-value shipments to Bruno's organization. They'd targeted Cole specifically because he often worked alone and took the same routes, making him predictable. Bruno Castellano was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder, armed robbery, and conspiracy. His partner, identified as Marcus Webb, got 12 years. The inside source at the shipping company was also arrested and charged, but Cole knew there were others out there, other crews looking for easy scores on the isolated stretches of the overseas highway. The incident changed how Cole operated. He varied his routes and schedules, never stopping at the same places twice in a row. He added more security features to his truck and started carrying a legal firearm. Most importantly, he learned to trust his instincts completely. That uneasy feeling about the white van had been his subconscious recognizing danger before his conscious mind caught up. The restaurant at mile marker 50 became something of a shrine for Cole. He stopped there regularly, always tipping Pearl generously and checking in with Deputy Williams when their paths crossed. They'd shared something that night, a moment when evil had shown its face and been defeated by quick thinking and good people working together. But Cole never forgot how close it had come. A few seconds difference, a moment of hesitation, and he could have been another statistic. Another driver who disappeared with valuable cargo somewhere along the scenic but dangerous route through the Keys. The paradise-like setting of the Florida Keys could make people complacent, forgetting that predators existed even in the most beautiful places. Word spread through the trucking community about the attempted hijacking. Other drivers started sharing information about suspicious vehicles and individuals, creating an informal network of protection. Cole became something of a legend, the driver who'd fought off an armed robbery and helped take down a theft ring. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor who'd gotten lucky. The high-value loads kept coming, and Cole kept hauling them. The money was too good to pass up, and he'd proven he could handle the risk. But he never relaxed, never let his guard down. Every stop was planned. Every person assessed for threat level. It was exhausting, but it kept him alive and his cargo secure. 6 months after the incident, Cole received a letter from the restaurant that had been waiting for his wine shipment. They thanked him for his bravery in protecting their investment and offered him a lifetime of free meals whenever he was in Key West. It was a nice gesture, but Cole knew the real reward was still being alive to appreciate it. The overseas highway remained one of the most beautiful drives in America, but for Cole, it would always carry a shadow of danger. Every white van made his pulse quicken. Every suspicious stranger in a restaurant put him on edge. But he kept driving, kept delivering, kept watching. Because that's what truckers do. They face the dangers of the road and keep America's goods moving, even when those dangers come in human form. Late at night, when Cole was driving through the darkness with nothing but the sound of his engine and the occasional splash of waves against the bridge's supports, he'd think about that night at mile marker 50. He'd remember Bruno's gold tooth gleaming in the dim light, the feel of the gun pressed against his ribs, the sound of bullets hitting his truck. But mostly, he'd remember Pearl's quick thinking and Deputy Williams' bravery. He'd remember that even in the darkest moments, when criminals tried to destroy everything he'd worked for, there were still good people willing to help. That knowledge kept him going through the long nights and dangerous miles. The Florida Keys stretched for over 100 miles, a ribbon of islands connected by bridges and filled with beauty and danger in equal measure. For truckers like Cole, it's both a paradise and a gauntlet, a place where million-dollar views exist alongside million-dollar crimes. The isolation that makes it beautiful also makes it vulnerable, and those who travel its length must always be prepared for both. Cole Patterson continued to drive the Keys route for another 5 years before finally selling his truck and retiring to a small house in Central Florida, far from the ocean and the memories it carried. But even in retirement, he kept in touch with other drivers, warning them about the dangers, sharing his hard-won knowledge about staying safe on dangerous routes. His story became required reading at several trucking companies' safety meetings. New drivers would listen wide-eyed as trainers recounted the night Cole Patterson fought off armed hijackers at mile marker 50. Some thought it was exaggerated, a cautionary tale inflated for effect. But those who'd been driving for a while knew better. They'd all had their close calls, their moments when the job turned dangerous. The restaurant at mile marker 50 eventually closed, unable to recover from the reputation as a crime scene. But the parking area remained, and truckers still stopped there, always careful, always watching. Some claimed you could still see the bullet marks in the asphalt where Bruno's wild shots had struck. Others said it was just normal wear and tear, but everyone agreed it was a place to be extra careful, especially at night. Pearl moved to the mainland, the excitement of that night convincing her that the Keys were too dangerous for a woman alone. Deputy Williams was promoted to detective, his quick response to the robbery attempt earning him recognition. Bruno Castellano died in prison 2 years into his sentence, stabbed by another inmate over a gambling debt. His partner, Marcus Webb, was released after serving 10 years and promptly disappeared, some say to Mexico. Others say he's still in Florida under a new name. The wine shipment that almost cost Cole his life was eventually delivered and served at the restaurant's grand opening. The owner, knowing the story behind the bottles, priced them at a premium, marketing them as the wines that survived an attempted hijacking. Tourists loved the story, not knowing how close it had come to ending differently. Cole kept one bottle from that shipment, a red wine that he never opened. It sat on a shelf in his home, a reminder of the night he faced death and won. Sometimes he'd look at it and remember the weight of Bruno's hand on his arm, the cold press of the gun against his ribs, the moment when everything could have ended. But the bottle also reminded him of Pearl's courage, Deputy Williams's bravery, and his own refusal to be a victim. It represented survival, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of American truckers who face danger every day to keep the country running. That bottle was his trophy, not for winning, but for surviving. The overseas highway continues to be one of the most challenging and beautiful routes in American trucking. Drivers still face the same dangers Cole faced: isolation, limited escape routes, and criminals who see truckers as easy targets. But they also face those dangers with better preparation, thanks to drivers like Cole who survived and shared their stories. Modern technology has made the route safer. Better cell coverage, GPS tracking, and panic buttons have reduced the vulnerability of drivers. But technology can't eliminate human predators entirely. They adapt, finding new ways to exploit weaknesses, new methods to separate drivers from their valuable cargo. The game continues, with stakes that are literally life and death. Cole's story serves as both warning and inspiration. It warns drivers about the very real dangers of complacency, of predictable routes, of stopping in isolated areas, but it also inspires them to be prepared, to trust their instincts, and to know that even when facing armed criminals, quick thinking and courage can prevail. Every year on the anniversary of the attempted hijacking, Cole makes a phone call to Pearl and Deputy Williams, now Detective Williams. They don't talk long, just enough to confirm they're all still alive, still fighting their own battles. It's a tradition born from shared trauma, but sustained by mutual respect. The trucking industry has thousands of Cole Pattersons, drivers who've faced danger and survived to haul another day. Their stories rarely make the news, their heroism unrecognized outside the tight-knit community of long-haul drivers. But within that community, they're legends, their experiences becoming the folklore that helps keep other drivers safe. Cole Patterson's encounter at mile marker 50 was a reminder that in the trucking industry, danger doesn't always come from weather, mechanical failure, or road conditions. Sometimes it comes from other humans, predators who see truckers not as hardworking professionals but as opportunities for crime. Being prepared for those human dangers is just as important as being prepared for any other hazard of the road. The Florida Keys remain a jewel of American geography, a tropical paradise that attracts millions of visitors each year. But for the truckers who navigate its narrow highway, carrying everything from beer to luxury goods, it's also a corridor of vulnerability where beauty and danger exist in constant tension. They drive it because it's their job, because someone has to keep the Keys supplied with the goods that sustain paradise. And somewhere on that long stretch of highway, at a partially abandoned rest stop near mile marker 50, the ghosts of that September night still linger. Not supernatural ghosts, but the very real memories of a night when evil tried to prevail, and was stopped by the combined courage of a trucker, a waitress, and a deputy sheriff. It's a reminder that while predators may lurk in paradise, so do heroes, ordinary people who rise to extraordinary circumstances when called upon. Troy Washington had driven through 3 hurricanes in his 15-year career, hauling freight across Florida. But Hurricane Catherine was shaping up to be different. The Category 4 monster was bearing down on the Gulf Coast with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour, and every news station was calling it the storm of the decade. Troy's dispatcher had called him at 3 a.m. with an emergency request. Evacuate a load of medical supplies from a Tampa hospital to an Atlanta distribution center before the storm made landfall. At 38 years old, Troy had built his reputation on being reliable in crisis situations. When other drivers refused dangerous runs, Troy stepped up. His 2020 Freightliner Cascadia was built for these moments, equipped with reinforced windows, enhanced stability control, and all-weather tires that could handle standing water. But even Troy had reservations about this run. The storm was moving faster than predicted, and the window for safe travel was closing rapidly. The loading dock at Tampa General Hospital was chaos when Troy arrived at 5 a.m. Emergency vehicles, ambulances, and other trucks were all trying to evacuate critical supplies and patients. Troy watched nurses and orderlies running through the rain that had already started, the outer bands of Catherine beginning to lash the coast. He backed his trailer to the dock with practiced precision, trying to ignore the wind that was already strong enough to rock his massive rig. A harried loading supervisor checked his paperwork quickly. "You've got 30 minutes to load and get out," she shouted over the wind. "After that, they're closing the highways." This is literally life-saving stuff. Insulin, antibiotics, emergency surgical supplies. Hospitals in Georgia are counting on this. Troy helped with the loading himself, securing each pallet with extra care. In hurricane conditions, any shifting load could be catastrophic. By 5:45 a.m., he was pulling out of the hospital, entering a stream of evacuation traffic heading north on Interstate 75. The rain was coming in sheets now, visibility down to maybe 50 feet. Most passenger vehicles were struggling to maintain control, but Troy's heavy rig cut through the wind with determined stability. The first 100 miles went better than expected. The interstate was crowded but moving, and while the weather was deteriorating, it was still manageable. Troy maintained a steady 45 miles per hour, watching his mirrors constantly for vehicles that might lose control and slide into him. His CB radio crackled with constant updates from other truckers, reporting conditions ahead and behind. It was near Ocala when things started to go wrong. A massive oak tree, its roots loosened by the saturated ground, toppled across all northbound lanes. Traffic came to a complete stop. Troy could see emergency vehicles trying to reach the blockage, but they were having trouble getting through the packed highway. The wind was howling now, strong enough that Troy could feel his trailer wanting to tip despite its heavy load. After an hour of waiting, a woman appeared at Troy's driver's side door, knocking frantically. She was middle-aged, soaked to the skin, with a wild look in her eyes. Troy cracked the window slightly, keeping one hand on his phone ready to call 911. "Please, you have to help me," the woman shouted over the storm. "My name is Donna. My car broke down back there. My kids are with me. We need shelter." Troy looked in his mirrors, but couldn't see any broken-down vehicle through the rain. "Where's your car?" he asked. "About a quarter-mile back." "Please, my daughter's diabetic and needs her insulin. We're from Miami, trying to get to my sister's in Valdosta." Donna's desperation seemed genuine, but something felt off to Troy. "I can't take passengers," Troy said, which was technically true but not absolute. "Insurance regulations. But I can call state police for you." Donna's expression changed, the desperation replaced by something harder. "State police won't come. They're all dealing with the tree. Look, I'll pay you. 500 cash to get us to the next exit where we can find shelter." Before Troy could respond, he noticed movement in his passenger side mirror. Two men were approaching his trailer from the rear, trying to stay hidden behind vehicles. One was carrying what looked like bolt cutters. Troy's blood went cold. This wasn't a stranded family, this was an ambush. Troy immediately locked his doors and grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker. This is Unit 47 at mile marker 341. Got a situation here. Multiple individuals attempting to breach my trailer. Need immediate assistance." Donna's face contorted with rage. She pounded on the window. "Open this door. We know what you're carrying. Medical supplies that people need." One of the men had reached Troy's trailer and was working on the lock. Troy threw the truck in gear and pulled forward, not far. Traffic wouldn't allow it, but enough to knock the man off balance. The would-be thief fell into the flooding roadway, scrambling to avoid being crushed by Troy's rear wheels. Other truckers responded to Troy's call. A driver 3 vehicles back laid on his air horn, the deafening blast drawing attention. Another trucker, positioned ahead of Troy, got out with a tire iron, making it clear he was ready to defend a fellow driver. The attempted thieves, realizing they were outnumbered and exposed, retreated into the storm. But Troy's problems were just beginning. As traffic finally started moving around the fallen tree, directed onto the shoulder by state troopers who had arrived, his engine began to sputter. The fuel filter, he realized with dread, had probably sucked up water from contaminated fuel at his last stop. The engine died completely just as he cleared the obstacle, forcing him to coast onto the exit ramp for State Road 40. The exit led to a small rural area, mostly farmland and scattered houses. Through the driving rain, Troy could see a few buildings, a closed gas station, what looked like an abandoned restaurant, and further down, a lit-up structure that might be a storm shelter. With no other choice, he managed to coast into the gas station's parking lot before his rig stopped completely. Troy tried his cell phone. No signal. The storm had likely knocked out the nearest towers. His CB radio still worked, but the responses were garbled and distant. He was effectively alone, broken down in a hurricane with a trailer full of valuable medical supplies that desperate people apparently knew about. The wind was screaming now, strong enough that Troy could feel his truck rocking despite its weight. Debris flew past his windshield, pieces of roofing, tree branches, an entire stop sign that clanged off his hood. He couldn't stay here. The truck could tip or be crushed by flying debris. But venturing out meant leaving his cargo vulnerable. A knock on his passenger door made him jump. Through the rain-lashed window, he could see a man in a police uniform. Troy's first instinct was relief, but something made him hesitate. The uniform looked wrong somehow, too clean, too new, like a costume rather than working clothes. And what cop would be out in this storm alone? "Florida Highway Patrol," the man shouted. "You need to evacuate to the shelter immediately." "Let me see your badge," Troy called back. The man held up something that might have been a badge, but through the rain and distance, Troy couldn't verify it. "There's no time for this. The storm surge is coming." Troy knew they were too far inland for storm surge. This was another attempted theft, more sophisticated than Donna's approach. "I'll follow you in a minute. Just need to secure my load." The fake officer's demeanor changed. "Open this vehicle now, or I'll have you arrested for failure to comply with emergency evacuation orders." Troy grabbed his phone and started recording video, making sure to capture the man's face. "I'm recording this interaction, officer." "What's your badge number?" The man's hand went to his hip, where a gun holster would be, but Troy noticed there was no actual weapon there. It was all show. The fake cop realized his bluff had been called and backed away from the truck, disappearing into the storm. Troy knew he couldn't stay in the cab much longer. The wind was intensifying, and he could hear metal creaking ominously. He grabbed his emergency bag, which contained water, food, a first aid kit, and most importantly, a satellite emergency beacon. If he had to abandon the truck, at least he could call for help once the storm passed. As he prepared to make a run for the sturdy-looking building down the road, another vehicle pulled into the gas station. A genuine Monroe County Sheriff's SUV with proper emergency lights. The deputy who got out was wearing a rain slicker over his uniform, and his badge was prominently displayed. "You the driver who called in the attempted theft?" the deputy shouted. "That's me," Troy confirmed, relief washing over him. "How did you know?" "Other truckers have been calling it in all along the evacuation route. Seems like there's organized groups trying to raid medical supply trucks. I'm Deputy Max Chen. We need to get you to proper shelter now." Troy made a quick decision. "I can't leave the cargo. Too many people are depending on these medical supplies." Deputy Chen looked at the truck, then at the intensifying storm. "The shelter is that building down there. It's a reinforced community center. Tell you what, I'll help you drive the truck there. It's got a loading dock we can back against. Make it harder for anyone to break in." Together, they worked on the fuel system, with Chen producing a small bottle of fuel treatment from his vehicle. "Keep this stuff for exactly this situation," he explained. After several attempts, the engine roared back to life. Troy followed the deputy's SUV through the hurricane winds to the community center. It was a solid, concrete structure, built after Hurricane Andrew to serve as an emergency shelter. About 40 people were already inside, locals who hadn't evacuated in time. Troy backed his trailer tight against the building's loading dock, creating a barrier that would be nearly impossible to breach in the storm. Inside the shelter, the atmosphere was tense. The building shook with each gust, and the sound of the wind was like a freight train that never passed. Troy found a corner where he could watch the door that connected to the loading dock, his hand never far from the tire iron he'd brought from his truck. Around 10 p.m., with the hurricane reaching its peak, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. That's when Troy noticed that several of the evacuees in the shelter were the same people from the highway, including Donna and her supposed accomplices. They must have followed him here. Deputy Chen noticed too. He positioned himself strategically, making it clear he was watching them. "They can't do anything while I'm here," he told Troy quietly, "and backup will come once the storm passes." But the thieves were desperate and organized. Around midnight, when the deputy was checking on an elderly couple in distress, they made their move. 4 of them approached Troy simultaneously, trying to surround him. "We don't want trouble," Donna said, though her hand was inside her jacket, possibly on a weapon. "But people are dying out there without medicine. You're sitting on supplies that could save lives." "These supplies are tagged and tracked," Troy replied loudly, making sure others in the shelter could hear. "They're going to specific hospitals with specific patients waiting. You take them. Those patients don't get their medicine." "We're not thieves," one of the men claimed. "We're trying to help people the system forgot. The hospitals in poor neighborhoods that won't get shipments. The people who can't afford insulin." It was a good story, but Troy had heard variations of it before. These were professional thieves using the hurricane as cover for organized crime. Then work with the authorities to distribute supplies properly, he said. The confrontation was interrupted by an enormous crash. Part of the roof had been torn away, and rain was pouring in. Everyone scrambled for cover, the attempted theft forgotten in the face of immediate survival. Troy helped move elderly evacuees away from the breach while the thieves, faced with the reality of the storm's power, abandoned their plan. The hurricane passed around 4 a.m., leaving destruction in its wake. When dawn broke, Troy ventured outside to find a transformed landscape. Trees were down everywhere, power lines draped across roads like party streamers. His truck had survived, though with significant cosmetic damage. The trailer, pressed against the building, was intact. Deputy Chen had called for backup as soon as communications were restored. State police arrived to arrest Donna and her accomplices, who were found with burglary tools and detailed information about medical supply shipments throughout Florida. They were part of a ring that had been operating for months, using natural disasters as opportunities for theft. Troy's delivery was delayed by 24 hours, but the medical supplies reached Atlanta intact. The hospitals that received them sent letters of appreciation, noting that the supplies had been critical in treating injured evacuees from the hurricane. Troy had protected more than just cargo. He'd protected a lifeline for hurricane victims. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the theft ring's operation. They had informants at several hospitals who would alert them to valuable shipments. They used the chaos of evacuations to strike, knowing that law enforcement would be overwhelmed. Troy's video evidence and Deputy Chen's arrest led to the ring's dismantlement. Troy received a commendation from the Florida Trucking Association and a reward from the insurance company. But more meaningful to him were the messages from other truckers who'd heard about his stand. In an industry where drivers often feel isolated and vulnerable, Troy had shown that they could protect each other and their cargo even in the worst conditions. The hurricane had caused billions in damage across Florida, but it had also revealed both the worst and best of humanity. While some had tried to exploit the chaos for crime, others like Deputy Chen had risked their lives to maintain order. And truckers like Troy had ensured that critical supplies reached those in need, despite facing both natural and human threats. Troy continued driving for another 10 years, though he never forgot that night in the shelter. He became an advocate for better security training for drivers, especially regarding disaster situations. He'd learned that hurricanes brought out more than just wind and rain. They brought out predators who saw opportunity in chaos. The community center where Troy had sheltered was rebuilt and reinforced, with a plaque acknowledging the hurricane evacuation of 2024 and the truckers who'd risked their lives to deliver emergency supplies. Troy's truck, despite its battle scars, served him for another 500,000 miles before he finally retired it. The fake officer who'd tried to intimidate Troy was never caught, but his image from Troy's video was circulated among trucking companies as a warning. Several other drivers reported similar encounters during subsequent storms, suggesting that the impersonation of authority figures had become a standard tactic for hurricane thieves. Donna served 3 years in prison for attempted grand theft and conspiracy. Upon her release, she disappeared, some say to Texas, others to Mexico. The medical supplies she'd tried to steal would have been worth over $2 million on the black market, funding further criminal operations. Hurricane Catherine went down in history as one of the most destructive storms to hit Florida, but also as a catalyst for improved emergency logistics. New protocols were developed for protecting medical shipments during disasters, including armed escorts and satellite tracking. Troy's experience had shown that it wasn't enough to plan for the storm. You had to plan for those who would exploit it. For Troy, the hurricane had been a test not just of his driving skills but of his character. when faced with threats, intimidation, and the promise of easy money to look the other way, he'd stood firm. The medical supplies he protected had gone on to save lives, a fact that gave meaning to that terrifying night. Years later, Troy would tell rookies about Hurricane Catherine, about the fake cop and the shelter showdown. Some thought he was exaggerating, that no one would try to rob a truck in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane. But the veterans knew better. They'd all faced their own storms, both literal and metaphorical. The lesson Troy always emphasized was simple. In a crisis, predators emerge alongside heroes. The uniform doesn't make the authority. Desperation doesn't justify theft, and a trucker's duty to their cargo doesn't end when the weather turns bad. It intensifies because that's when the cargo becomes most valuable and most vulnerable. His story became part of hurricane preparedness training for many Florida trucking companies. New drivers learned about the fake officer trick, the family, in distress ploy, and the importance of verifying authority even in emergency situations. They learned that hurricanes created a perfect storm of opportunity for criminals who counted on chaos to cover their crimes. Deputy Max Chen went on to become Sheriff Chen, his handling of hurricane-related crimes earning him respect and recognition. He and Troy remained friends, meeting annually on the anniversary of Hurricane Catherine to remember that night when they'd stood together against both natural and human threats. The medical supplies Troy had protected were traced to their final destinations: insulin to diabetic children in Atlanta, antibiotics to hurricane injury victims, surgical supplies to emergency rooms overwhelmed with casualties. Each vial and bandage represented a life potentially saved because one trucker refused to abandon his post. The gas station where Troy had first broken down was never rebuilt, but truckers still knew the spot. It became an informal memorial to all the drivers who'd faced danger during evacuations. Someone had spray-painted on the remaining wall. Troy Washington held the line here. Hurricane Catherine, 2024. In the end, Troy's hurricane story wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about maintaining integrity when everything around you is falling apart. It was about recognizing that in the chaos of disaster, the thin line between civilization and criminality becomes even thinner. And sometimes a trucker with a tire iron is all that stands between order and chaos. The Florida hurricane season continues to challenge truckers every year. They drive into the storms when everyone else is fleeing, carrying the supplies that make recovery possible. They face not just wind and rain, but those who would exploit disaster for profit. And they do it because it's their job, their duty, their calling. Troy Washington retired to a small house in central Florida, far enough inland to avoid storm surge but close enough to remember. On hurricane nights, when the wind howls and the rain pounds, he thinks about the drivers out there facing the storm. He knows that somewhere, a trucker is protecting critical cargo from both natural and human threats, holding the line as he once did. His CB handle had been Storm Rider, and it had never been more appropriate than during Hurricane Catherine. He'd ridden out one of the worst storms in Florida history while protecting medical supplies from desperate thieves. It was a story worth telling, a warning worth heeding, and a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear trucker caps and drive 18-wheelers through hurricanes, protecting what needs protecting, no matter the cost. Glenn Foster had been driving the Interstate 75 corridor through Florida for 12 years, and he knew every rest area between Miami and the Georgia border like they were rooms in his own house. The Payne's Prairie Rest area near Gainesville was one of his regular stops, a clean, well-lit facility where he could grab coffee, stretch his legs, and catch a few hours of sleep in relative safety. But on this humid October night, something was different. It was just past 2 a.m. when Glenn pulled his 2017 Volvo VNL into the truck parking area. He'd been hauling a load of construction equipment from Fort Myers to Atlanta, fighting drowsiness for the last 50 miles. Federal regulations required him to rest, and his electronic logbook would show any violations. Plus, Glenn was a professional. He knew driving tired was as dangerous as driving drunk. The rest area was busier than usual for this hour. Glenn counted 8 other rigs in the lot, which wasn't uncommon, but what caught his attention was the unusual activity around several of them. Drivers were standing in small groups, talking in hushed tones, some gesturing animatedly. In his experience, truckers congregating at 2 a.m. meant either something very good or very bad had happened. Glenn backed into a spot between 2 other trucks, a standard defensive position that would make it harder for anyone to access his trailer. As he set his brakes and completed his log entries, he noticed a man approaching in his driver's side mirror. The guy was tall, wearing a trucker's cap and a reflective vest, but something about his walk seemed off. Too casual, too confident, like someone playing a role rather than living it. The man knocked on Glenn's door with a friendly rap. "Hey there, brother." "Name's Mitch. You just coming through?" Glenn cracked his window slightly. 20 years of driving had taught him to be cautiously friendly. "Yeah, heading north. You?" Mitch leaned against Glenn's truck, too comfortable for a stranger. "Been here about an hour. Crazy stuff happening tonight. You hear about the inspection setup they got going?" "Inspection? At 2 a.m.? Glenn's suspicion deepened. DOT rarely did night inspections at rest areas, and when they did, there would be obvious signs. Official vehicles, bright lights, officers in uniform. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Mitch said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But they're checking specific trucks. Word is they're looking for contraband. Some big drug shipment supposed to be coming through tonight. They're offering cash rewards for tips." Glenn had heard enough scams to recognize one brewing. "That's interesting. Which agency is running it?" Mitch's hesitation was barely noticeable, but Glenn caught it. "Joint Task Force. DEA, State Police, bunch of alphabets. They set up in the back of the rest area, trying to be discreet." "I'll keep an eye out," Glenn said non-committally. "Thanks for the heads up." Mitch didn't move away. "Thing is, they're being real selective about who they check. Almost like they got inside information, you know? Makes a fellow wonder what some of these drivers are really hauling." There it was, the soft accusation, the planted seed of suspicion. Glenn had seen this before. Criminals posing as concerned citizens, trying to turn truckers against each other, creating chaos they could exploit. "I suppose everyone's got secrets," Glenn replied carefully. "But I'm just hauling construction equipment." Nothing interesting about excavators and bulldozers. Mitch's eyes lit up slightly. "Construction equipment? That's good money. Market for that stuff is hot right now, especially down in Miami. You independent or company?" Too many questions, too much interest. Glenn's hand moved to his phone. "Company driver. Everything's tracked and monitored. Can't even stop for coffee without corporate knowing about it." That seemed to disappoint Mitch, who finally stepped back. "Well, stay safe out there. Lots of dangerous people at these rest stops. You can't trust anyone these days." As Mitch walked away, Glenn watched him approach another truck. Within minutes, he was having a similar conversation with that driver. Glenn grabbed his CB radio and switched to Channel 19, the unofficial truckers channel. "Breaker, breaker, this is Road Dog at Payne's Prairie. Anyone else getting weird vibes from the guy in the reflective vest?" Several responses came immediately. 10-4, Road Dog. Dude tried to tell me there was a mandatory inspection. Wanted to know what I was hauling. Another voice. He's got at least 2 buddies working the other side of the lot. They're fishing for something. A third chimed in. This is Big Kent in the Kenworth. I've been watching them for an hour. They're definitely casing trucks. Already saw them try door handles on a couple of rigs where the drivers are sleeping. Glenn made a decision. I'm calling it in. Everyone lock up tight and watch each other's backs. He dialed 911, but as he waited for it to connect, his passenger door suddenly rattled. Someone was trying to get in. Glenn looked over to see another man, younger than Mitch, working at his door handle with some kind of tool. The man's eyes met Glenn's through the window, and instead of running, he smiled and held up what looked like a badge. Federal agent. Open up. Glenn knew immediately it was fake. No federal agent would be trying to break into his truck. He laid on his air horn, the deafening blast echoing across the rest area. The fake agent jumped back, and suddenly the parking lot erupted in activity. Mitch and 2 other men converged on Glenn's truck, no longer pretending to be friendly. One was carrying a crowbar. Another had what looked like a pistol tucked in his waistband, but they'd miscalculated. The other truckers, already alert from the CB chatter, were getting out of their cabs, several carrying tire irons or baseball bats. "Back off!" shouted the driver Kent, a massive man who looked like he'd been a linebacker before becoming a trucker. "We've already called the real cops." Mitch tried to maintain his con. "We are the cops. This is a federal investigation." "Bullshit," another driver yelled. "Let's see some real badges and warrants." The situation was escalating toward violence when actual police sirens became audible in the distance. Mitch and his crew exchanged glances, then made a run for a van parked in the visitors section. But Kent and 2 other drivers had anticipated this, positioning themselves to block the van's exit. The fake cops tried to ram through, but Kent's truck was already moving, pulling across the exit lane. The van skidded to a stop, trapped between the truck and a concrete barrier. Mitch and his accomplices abandoned the vehicle and fled on foot into the woods surrounding the rest area. Real state troopers arrived within minutes, followed by K-9 units. Glenn gave his statement to Officer Patricia Williams, a veteran trooper who seemed unsurprised by the incident. "We've had reports of this crew working rest areas along E75 for the past month," she explained. "They pose as cops or concerned citizens, identify valuable loads, then either rob the drivers or follow them to isolated areas for hijacking. You guys did exactly right by sticking together." The abandoned van contained fake badges, police costumes, braking tools, and detailed notes about truck schedules and cargo types. They'd been sophisticated, but not sophisticated enough to fool experienced drivers who looked out for each other. The K-9 units tracked Mitch and 1 accomplice to a nearby swamp where they were arrested. The third man was caught trying to hitchhike on the interstate. Under interrogation, they revealed they were part of a larger ring targeting truckers across the southeast, using rest areas as hunting grounds. Glenn spent the rest of the night giving statements and drinking coffee with the other drivers who'd stood together against the criminals. Kent turned out to be a former Marine who'd recognized the fake authority routine from similar cons attempted overseas. "These guys count on truckers being isolated and afraid of authority," Kent explained. "But we're not as alone as they think. We've got each other's backs out here." The incident became known in trucker circles as the Payne's Prairie Standoff, a reminder that criminals often targeted rest areas because they thought drivers were vulnerable. But it also showed that the trucking community could protect itself when drivers stayed alert and worked together. Glenn's company commended him for his quick thinking and for protecting his cargo. But Glenn knew the real heroes were all the drivers who'd stepped up that night, ready to defend fellow truckers they'd never met before. It was an unwritten code of the road. You might drive alone, but you were part of a brotherhood that stretched across every highway in America. The investigation revealed that Mitch's real name was Mitchell Brennan, a former security guard who'd been fired for theft. He'd recruited other criminals with the promise of easy scores from isolated truckers. They'd successfully robbed 6 drivers before encountering Glenn and the others at Payne's Prairie. The rest area increased security after the incident, adding cameras and increasing police patrols. But Glenn knew that technology and law enforcement could only do so much. The real protection came from drivers watching out for each other, sharing information, and refusing to be intimidated by fake authority. Glenn continued to stop at Payne's Prairie on his regular runs, but now he was part of an informal network of drivers who kept tabs on suspicious activity at rest areas throughout Florida. They had a private channel on the CB and a group text that warned of potential dangers. It wasn't official, but it was effective. 3 weeks after the incident, Glenn was back at Payne's Prairie, this time in daylight. He recognized several of the drivers from that night, and they exchanged nods of acknowledgement. The shared experience had created a bond that transcended company rivalries or personal differences. Kent approached Glenn's truck with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this. Long night?" "Drove straight through from Miami," Glenn admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed." Kent's expression turned serious. "You weren't the only one." 3 drivers reported suspicious vehicles tailing them after leaving rest areas this week. These bastards didn't give up, they just changed tactics. Glenn had heard similar reports. The arrests at Payne's Prairie had disrupted but not destroyed the criminal ring. They'd adapted, becoming more subtle but no less dangerous. Instead of confronting drivers directly, they were following them to isolated areas or waiting for mechanical breakdowns. "Had a guy approach me yesterday," Kent continued. "Different rest area, same routine. Wanted to know what I was hauling, where I was headed. But this time, he had a woman with him. Made it seem like casual conversation between travelers." Glenn nodded. "They're learning. Getting smarter about it." A newcomer to their group, a young driver named Stan, joined them. "You guys talking about the rest area thieves? My dispatcher says we should avoid stopping at night altogether." "Can't always do that," Glenn pointed out. "Regulations require rest periods. And running scared isn't the answer. We just need to be smarter than they are." Over the following months, Glenn became something of an expert on rest area security. He studied patterns, compiled reports from other drivers, and even worked with law enforcement to identify potential threats. He learned that the criminals had specific methods for choosing victims. They looked for drivers who seemed tired or distracted, who parked in isolated spots, who traveled the same routes at predictable times. They preferred targeting owner-operators over company drivers, knowing independents had less corporate support. They were especially interested in loads that could be easily sold: electronics, pharmaceuticals, high-end retail goods. Glenn started giving informal safety briefings at truck stops, sharing what he'd learned. "Never park with your doors facing away from other trucks," he'd advise. "Always do a walk around before sleeping. Check for anyone watching you. If someone approaches with too many questions, get on the CB immediately. And never, ever believe someone who claims to be law enforcement without proper verification." His vigilance paid off one night at a rest area near Ocala. Glenn noticed a pattern he'd seen before. 2 men working in coordination, one distracting drivers with conversation while the other surveyed trucks. He quietly alerted other drivers, and they implemented what they'd come to call the Payne's Prairie Protocol. Every driver in the rest area suddenly became very visible, getting out of their trucks, congregating in well-lit areas, making it clear they were watching everything. The suspected thieves, realizing they were blown, left without incident. It was a victory without confrontation, the kind Glenn preferred. But the criminals were persistent and innovative. They started using technology, jamming CB frequencies at certain rest areas to prevent drivers from communicating. They employed spotters at truck stops to identify valuable loads before they even reached rest areas. Some even tried hacking into electronic logging devices to track driver schedules. Glenn's response was to embrace technology as well. He helped establish a smartphone app where drivers could quickly report and share information about suspicious activity. The app included photos of known criminals, descriptions of their methods, and real-time alerts about dangerous situations. The turning point came 8 months after the original Payne's Prairie incident. Glenn was at a rest area near Lake City when he recognized a face from the app's database. Not Mitch, but someone associated with the same ring. The man was working with 2 others, and they were clearly casing trucks. This time, Glenn didn't just alert other drivers. He coordinated a sophisticated response. While some drivers created a visible presence to deter immediate action, others discreetly documented everything with phones and dash cams. When the criminals made their move, attempting to break into a truck whose driver was supposedly sleeping, they were not only caught in the act, but recorded from multiple angles. The evidence was overwhelming. The arrests led to a broader investigation that uncovered the full scope of the criminal network. It turned out they weren't just thieves, but part of a larger organization involved in drug trafficking, using stolen truck cargo to fund their operations. The trial was a sensation in trucking circles. Glenn testified, as did Kent and dozens of other drivers who'd encountered the ring. Mitch Brennan, revealed to be one of the operation's key figures, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His accomplices received lesser but still significant sentences. The victory felt hollow to Glenn, though. For every criminal ring they stopped, another seemed to emerge. Rest areas remained dangerous, especially at night, especially for solo drivers. The very nature of trucking, long hours, isolation, valuable cargo, made drivers perpetual targets. Glenn's company recognized his efforts with a safety award and a bonus, but the real reward came from other drivers. He'd get messages from truckers who'd avoided robbery because of his warnings, who'd recognized danger because of patterns he'd identified. He'd helped transform a culture of isolated vulnerability into one of collective vigilance. The Payne's Prairie Rest area itself became something of a symbol. Truckers would stop there specifically to check in with each other, to share information, to reinforce the bonds that had been forged that night. Someone even put up an unofficial plaque. Here, truckers stood together. But Glenn knew the fight was far from over. Rest areas remained hunting grounds for predators who saw truckers as easy marks. The methods might change, the faces might be different, but the threat persisted. Every night, somewhere along America's highways, a driver was facing what Glenn had faced. Criminals masquerading as friends, authority figures who weren't real, danger disguised as help. His message to new drivers was always the same. Trust your instincts, but verify everything. A real cop won't mind you calling dispatch to confirm. A fellow trucker in genuine distress won't get angry if you're cautious. And remember, you're never as alone as you think. There's always another driver nearby ready to help if you just reach out. The technology continued to evolve. Rest areas installed better lighting and more cameras. Some states stationed security guards at major facilities. Apps and communication systems improved. But Glenn knew the most important security feature wasn't technological, it was human. It was drivers looking out for each other, sharing information, refusing to be victims. 5 years after the Paynes Prairie incident, Glenn was nearing retirement. He'd driven over 2 million miles without a major accident, delivered thousands of loads safely, and helped countless drivers avoid danger. But he still stopped at Paynes Prairie regularly, still kept watch, still shared his knowledge with anyone who would listen. On his last professional run before retirement, Glenn pulled into Paynes Prairie one final time. It was 2 a.m., the same time he'd arrived that fateful night years before. The rest area was quiet, peaceful even. A few trucks were parked, their drivers sleeping safely. Glenn did a walk around anyway, checking for anything suspicious, old habits dying hard. Kent was there, surprisingly, his truck parked in the same spot as that night. They hadn't planned it, but somehow it felt right. They stood in the parking lot, two aging truckers who'd shared a defining moment, watching the occasional car pass on the interstate. "You think we made a difference?" Kent asked. Glenn considered the question. "We showed them we're not easy targets. We proved truckers can protect each other." "Maybe that's enough," Kent nodded. "The new drivers, they don't really understand what it was like before. They take the safety measures for granted." "That's a good thing," Glenn replied. "Means we did our job." A young driver approached them, tentative and nervous. "Excuse me, are you Glenn Foster, the guy from the Paynes Prairie incident?" Glenn smiled. "That's me. Everything okay?" The young driver's face lit up. "I just wanted to thank you. Your safety videos helped me spot a scam attempt last week. Fake DOT inspector trying to find me for violations that didn't exist. I remembered what you said about verification and called it in. Turned out he'd hit 3 other drivers that day." After the young driver left, Glenn and Kent stood in comfortable silence. The rest area that had been a battlefield was now just another stop on the highway, made safer by their actions and sacrifice. The criminals who'd tried to make it their hunting ground were in prison, their network dismantled. But Glenn knew the real legacy wasn't the arrests or the trials. It was the culture change, the transformation of truckers from isolated targets to a connected community. Every driver who shared information, who watched out for others, who refused to be intimidated. They were all part of the Paynes Prairie legacy. Glenn retired the next week, but he didn't disappear from the trucking world. He consulted on security, trained new drivers, and maintained the safety network he'd helped create. The criminals might evolve, might find new ways to threaten drivers, but they'd always face the same obstacle. Truckers who refused to be victims, who stood together, who turned rest areas from hunting grounds into fortresses of mutual protection. The Paynes Prairie Rest Area stands today as it did then, a place where travelers stop to rest, refuel, and continue their journeys. But for those who know its history, it's something more. It's a monument to courage, solidarity, and the unbreakable spirit of American truckers who faced danger and chose to fight back together rather than suffer alone. Glenn Foster's name became legend in trucking circles, not because he was a hero, but because he was a trucker who did what truckers do. He identified a problem, found a solution, and shared it with others. The rest area encounter that could have ended in tragedy became instead a turning point, a moment when the hunted became the hunters, when victims became victors. And somewhere tonight, at a rest area in Florida or Georgia or anywhere else, a driver is remembering Glenn's lessons, watching for danger, ready to sound the alarm. The ghost of Paynes Prairie lives on, not as a haunting but as a guardian, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, in the most isolated places, truckers are never truly alone. The cycle continues. Criminals probe for weakness, drivers stand strong, lessons are learned and shared. It's a never-ending battle fought in parking lots and rest areas across America, with stakes that are literally life and death. But thanks to drivers like Glenn Foster and the night at Payne's Prairie, it's a battle the truckers are winning. One rest area at a time, one warned driver at a time, one shared story at a time. Wade Cooper had a rule about hitchhikers: never pick them up. In 18 years of driving truck, he'd kept that rule without exception. But on that sweltering July afternoon, traveling north on Florida's turnpike near Yeehaw Junction, something made him break it. Maybe it was the brutal heat shimmering off the asphalt, or the way the man stood there looking defeated, or just a moment of misplaced compassion. Whatever the reason, it nearly cost Wade his life. The man was standing at the Canoe Creek Service Plaza, not actively hitchhiking, but clearly stranded. He was in his 30s, clean-shaven, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that suggested office work rather than drifting. When Wade pulled in for fuel, the man approached respectfully, keeping his distance, hands visible. Everything about him seemed designed to appear non-threatening. "Excuse me, sir," the man said as Wade finished fueling his 2021 Freightliner. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but I'm in a tough spot. My name's Lyle. My car broke down about 5 miles back and my phone's dead. I'm trying to get to Orlando for a job interview. I know you're not supposed to take passengers, but I'm desperate." Wade studied him carefully. Lyle looked genuinely distressed, sweat soaking through his shirt in the 100-degree heat. His shoes were dress shoes, not practical for walking highway shoulders. He had a small backpack, not the worn gear of a professional drifter. Against every instinct, Wade found himself considering it. "Job interview?" Wade asked. Lyle nodded eagerly. "Assistant manager position at a logistics company. If I miss this, I lose the opportunity. I've been unemployed for 6 months. This could change everything." He pulled out a folder from his backpack, showing what appeared to be legitimate correspondence about the interview. Wade thought about his own struggles years ago, times when a stranger's kindness had made the difference. Orlando was only 40 miles up the road, barely out of his way. His dispatcher, Rose, wouldn't need to know about a quick passenger ride. "All right," Wade said, immediately regretting it even as the words left his mouth. "Orlando only. You sit where I tell you, don't touch anything, and we never met. Understood?" Lyle's face lit up with relief. "Thank you so much. You're literally saving my life here." Wade watched Lyle climb into the passenger seat, noting how he moved with surprising agility for someone supposedly exhausted from the heat. The man settled in, placing his backpack at his feet, and immediately started thanking Wade profusely. "I can't tell you how much this means," Lyle said as they pulled back onto the turnpike. "I was starting to think I'd be stuck there all night." Wade kept his responses short, already regretting his decision. Something felt off about Lyle, though he couldn't pinpoint what. The man's story made sense. His appearance fit the narrative, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match the grateful demeanor. They'd gone about 10 miles when Lyle's personality began to shift. The grateful nervousness faded, replaced by a casual confidence that seemed out of place. He started asking questions about Wade's truck, his route, his cargo. "What are you hauling?" Lyle asked, turning to look at the sleeper berth behind them. "Grocery store supplies," Wade replied curtly. "Nothing interesting." Lyle laughed, a sound that sent chills down Wade's spine. "Everything's interesting to somebody. You driving alone? No team partner?" Warning bells were going off in Wade's head now. My company tracks everything. GPS, speed, stops, they know exactly where I am at all times." "That's smart," Lyle said, his hand moving to his backpack. "Can't be too careful these days. Lots of dangerous people out there." Wade's hand instinctively moved toward the tire iron he kept beside his seat, but Lyle was faster. He pulled a large knife from his backpack, holding it low where passing vehicles wouldn't see it. "Here's what's going to happen," Lyle said, his voice completely different now, cold and professional. "You're going to keep driving nice and calm. You're going to take the next exit, and we're going to find somewhere quiet to discuss a business proposition." Wade's mind raced. At 70 miles per hour, any sudden moves could kill them both. The knife was within easy striking distance of his ribs. His phone was in the center console, but reaching for it would provoke Lyle. "You don't want to do this," Wade said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Armed robbery of a commercial vehicle is federal. You're looking at 20 years minimum." Lyle laughed again. "Only if they catch me, and they won't. See, Wade, yes, I know your name. It's on your registration. I've done this before, many times. You're going to report your truck stolen, tell them I forced you out at knife point. Insurance covers the loss, you keep your life. Everyone wins." Wade saw the exit approaching, State Road 60, leading to nowhere good for him. Once off the interstate, he'd lose any advantage. He made a decision that could have gone either way. Instead of slowing for the exit, Wade accelerated. "What are you doing?" Lyle demanded, pressing the knife against Wade's side. "You want the truck?" Wade said through gritted teeth. "Fine. But I'm not making it easy." He grabbed his CB radio with his free hand. "Breaker, breaker. Emergency at mile marker 168 northbound. Driver under attack. Need immediate assistance." Lyle slashed at Wade's arm, drawing blood, but Wade had already dropped the radio and grabbed Lyle's wrist with both hands, fighting for control of the knife while trying to keep the truck steady. They struggled violently, the truck swerving dangerously as other vehicles honked and dodged. Wade was bigger and stronger, but Lyle was desperate and vicious. The knife came dangerously close to Wade's throat before he managed to slam Lyle's hand against the dashboard, loosening his grip. The knife fell to the floor, and both men dove for it. In the chaos, Wade's foot came off the accelerator, and the truck began to slow. Lyle got his hand on the knife first, but Wade grabbed his tire iron and brought it down on Lyle's shoulder with a sickening crack. Lyle screamed and fell back against the passenger door. Wade managed to pull the truck onto the shoulder, air brakes hissing as they came to a stop. Lyle was clutching his shoulder, the knife forgotten on the floor. Wade grabbed it and threw it out his window, then held the tire iron ready for another strike. "Get out," Wade commanded. "Get out now, or I finish what I started." Lyle fumbled for the door handle with his good arm, his face twisted in pain and rage. "You're going to regret this. I know your truck number, your company. I'll find you." "Get in line," Wade growled. "Now get out before the cops arrive." Lyle tumbled out of the truck and limped toward the tree line. Wade immediately locked his doors and called 911, giving them Lyle's description and location. His arm was bleeding badly, but the cut wasn't deep. He wrapped it with a towel from his sleeper berth while waiting for police. The Florida Highway Patrol arrived within 10 minutes, followed by an ambulance. Wade gave his statement while EMTs treated his wound. The officers found Lyle hiding in the woods about a quarter-mile away, his shoulder dislocated, still carrying the backpack with another knife and zip ties that made his intentions clear. Detective Maria Santos from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement took over the investigation. She revealed that Lyle's real name was Lyle Hutchinson, wanted in 3 states for armed robbery and assault. "You're lucky," Detective Santos told Wade. Hutchinson's M.O. is to pose as a stranded motorist, gain sympathy, then rob or carjack his victims. 3 of his previous victims weren't as fortunate as you. 1 is still in a coma. Wade's dispatcher, Rose, was understandably upset when she learned what happened. 18 years without picking up a hitchhiker, and you choose now to start. But her anger was tempered with relief that Wade had survived. The incident made Wade famous in trucker circles. His CB emergency call had been heard by dozens of drivers, some of whom had called 911 themselves, helping ensure rapid police response. The recording of his call became part of training materials for trucking companies, a real-world example of how to handle crisis situations. But fame wasn't what Wade wanted. He wanted to forget the feeling of Lyle's knife against his ribs, the look in the man's eyes when the mask of desperation fell away to reveal the predator beneath. He wanted to stop replaying the what-ifs. What if Lyle had been faster? What if the struggle had caused a fatal accident? What if he'd taken that exit as commanded? Wade had to testify at Lyle's trial 6 months later. Lyle sat there in an orange jumpsuit, his shoulder healed, staring at Wade with undisguised hatred. During his testimony, Wade learned the full scope of Lyle's crimes: 7 confirmed robberies, 3 attempted murders, and suspected involvement in the disappearance of 2 truckers whose bodies were never found. Lyle was sentenced to life without parole, but not before making a statement that chilled Wade. Truckers think they're so tough, so smart. But you're all the same. Alone, vulnerable, predictable. There are more of us out there than you think, and we know exactly how to find you. The threat haunted Wade. He installed additional locks on his truck, started carrying legal protection, and never stopped at isolated rest areas. He became hypervigilant, suspicious of everyone who approached his truck. The open, friendly demeanor that had characterized his driving career was replaced by cautious paranoia. Rose, his dispatcher, noticed the change. You can't let him win, Wade. You can't let one psychopath destroy your faith in people. But Wade had learned a harsh lesson. The hitchhiker who seemed harmless, the stranded motorist who needed help, the friendly stranger at the truck stop, any of them could be predators. The knife scar on his arm was a permanent reminder of what happened when you let your guard down. He started giving talks at trucking schools, warning new drivers about the dangers. Never pick up hitchhikers was his first and most important rule. He'd show them the scar, tell them about Lyle's transformation from desperate job seeker to armed robber, explain how close he'd come to being another statistic. But you fought back, a young driver said after one talk. You won. I survived, Wade corrected. That's not the same as winning. Winning would have been never letting him in my truck in the first place. The Canoe Creek Service Plaza became a place Wade avoided, taking alternate routes even if they added miles. Other drivers understood. Places where violence occurred carried psychic weight that lasted long after the blood was cleaned up. 2 years after the incident, Wade got a call from Detective Santos. Another trucker had been attacked using the exact same M.O. Stranded motorist, job interview story, hidden weapon. The attacker was caught, and under interrogation admitted he'd learned the technique from Lyle in prison before Lyle's sentencing. He's teaching others, Detective Santos explained. Even from prison, he's spreading his methods. The news sent Wade into a spiral. How many Lyles were out there? How many desperate-looking people at rest stops were actually predators in disguise? He considered retiring early, finding safer work, but trucking was all he knew. Instead, he channeled his fear into action. He worked with law enforcement to create a database of common hitchhiker scams and attack methods. He helped establish a verification system where stranded motorists could be checked against law enforcement databases before drivers decided to help. The system wasn't perfect, but it was something. It gave drivers a tool beyond instinct and luck. Wade became a reluctant expert on trucker security, the guy who'd survived Lyle Hutchinson and lived to warn others. His truck became a fortress. Reinforced locks, security cameras, panic buttons connected directly to dispatch. Some drivers thought he was paranoid, but others understood. They'd had their own close calls, their own Lyles who'd shown them the darkness hiding behind desperate faces. Wade's relationship with Rose evolved from dispatcher driver to something more like partners in survival. She'd track his routes obsessively, checking in more than required, making sure he was never truly alone, even when he was hundreds of miles from help. "You saved my life that day," Wade told her once. "Your training about keeping the CB close, about emergency procedures, that's what got me through." "You saved your own life," Rose replied. "You fought back. Most people freeze." The truth was somewhere in between. Wade had survived through a combination of preparation, instinct, and luck. Change any variable, a sharper knife, a faster attack, a loss of nerve, and he'd be dead. 5 years after the attack, Wade finally picked up another hitchhiker. Not really a hitchhiker, but a fellow trucker whose rig had broken down. Someone Wade recognized from the circuit. Someone who could be verified. It was a small step toward reclaiming his humanity, toward not letting Lyle's evil define his entire worldview. But he never forgot the lesson of that July afternoon. Trust, once broken, never fully heals. Every stranger remained a potential threat, every act of kindness a possible trap. It was exhausting, living with that level of suspicion, but it was better than the alternative. Wade Cooper continued driving for another 8 years, completing over 1 million more miles without incident. He never had another violent encounter, though whether that was due to his precautions or simple luck, he never knew. The scar on his arm faded but never disappeared, a permanent reminder etched in flesh. When he finally retired, Wade moved to a small town in North Florida, far from the interstate highways he'd called home for so long. But even in retirement, he couldn't escape the memories. Every time he saw a hitchhiker on the local news, every time he heard about a trucker attacked, he was back in that cab, fighting for his life while trying to control 80,000 pounds of steel and cargo. His story became required reading at many trucking companies, part of orientation packages titled The Hitchhiker Rule, Why It Exists. New drivers would read about Wade Cooper and Lyle Hutchinson, about the knife fight at 70 miles per hour, about the thin line between compassion and catastrophe. Some drivers thought the story was exaggerated, a cautionary tale inflated for effect. But Wade knew the truth was actually worse than what was written. The reports couldn't capture the moment when Lyle's mask slipped, when the grateful stranger became a predator. They couldn't convey the terror of fighting for your life while trying not to crash, the weight of knowing that one wrong move would kill innocent people. Wade's final contribution to trucker safety was a simple, laminated card he had printed and distributed at truck stops. Before you help, verify identity. Call dispatch. Trust your instincts. Your kindness should never cost your life. Thousands of these cards ended up in trucks across America, tucked into visors or taped to dashboards. They were Wade's legacy, more than the miles driven or loads delivered. They were a warning from someone who'd learned the hard way that sometimes the person who needs help is actually the danger you need help from. The hitchhiker rule remains universal in trucking. Don't pick them up. It seems harsh, uncompassionate, against the helpful nature of most drivers. But every trucker knows the story behind the rule, the names of drivers who broke it and paid the price. Wade Cooper was lucky. He became a cautionary tale instead of a casualty. Somewhere on Florida's highways tonight, a trucker is passing a hitchhiker, seeing the desperate face, the pleading gesture, maybe even feeling that tug of compassion. But they'll remember Wade's story, the knife hidden in the backpack, the predator disguised as prey. They'll keep driving, doors locked, maybe feeling guilty but definitely staying alive. Because in the end, that's what the hitchhiker rule is about: survival. It's about recognizing that the road is full of dangers, and some of them look exactly like people in need. It's about accepting that professional driving sometimes requires choosing safety over compassion, that getting home alive matters more than being a good Samaritan. Wade Cooper broke the hitchhiker rule once, and survived to ensure others never would. His scar, his story, his warning cards, they all carry the same message. Your truck is your sanctuary, and anyone you let inside becomes a potential threat. It's a harsh lesson, but it's one written in blood, validated by violence and proven necessary by the predators who continue to hunt along America's highways. Drew Matheson pulled into the Sunshine State Truck Plaza off Interstate 4 near Lakeland just as the sun was setting on a humid Thursday evening. After 12 hours of fighting traffic from Jacksonville, his shoulders ached and his eyes burned from the constant vigilance required to navigate Florida's congested highways. The truck stop looked inviting with its bright lights, multiple fuel islands, and promises of hot food and clean showers. At 45, Drew had been driving for 22 years and thought he'd seen every scam, con, and hustle the trucking world had to offer. He'd been approached by lot lizards, fake charity collectors, people selling stolen goods, and even a few who tried the old, "I found this wallet, let's split the cash" routine. He prided himself on being too smart, too experienced to fall for any of it. Pride, as he would learn, comes before the fall. The truck stop was moderately busy, maybe 15 rigs scattered across the lot. Drew found a spot near the back, away from the noise but still within sight of the main building. He completed his electronic logs, noting he had 8 hours before he needed to roll again. Plenty of time for a meal, shower, and real sleep in his 2018 Kenworth T680's comfortable sleeper berth. As he climbed down from his cab, a well-dressed man approached him. The guy looked like management. Clean polo shirt with the truck stop logo, khakis, clipboard in hand, professional smile. His name tag read, Barry, Assistant Manager. "Evening, driver," Barry said with practiced friendliness. "Sorry to bother you, but we're having an issue with our payment systems. Credit card readers are down at the fuel islands and inside. We're asking drivers to prepay in cash, and we're offering a 15% discount for the inconvenience." Drew had encountered technical problems at truck stops before. It happened. How long until they're fixed? Barry made a show of checking his clipboard. Corporate says 2 to 3 hours, maybe longer. You know how these things go, but if you prepay now, we can guarantee your fuel at the discounted rate when the systems come back up. Something about Barry's manner was just slightly off. Too smooth, too prepared. But the discount was significant. On a full tank, it would save Drew almost $100. Money that would go straight into his pocket as an owner-operator. "I need to think about it," Drew said. Sure, Barry replied. "But we can only honor the discount for the next hour. Corporate policy. I'll be in the office if you decide to take advantage of it." Drew watched Barry approach another driver with the same spiel. The driver seemed to buy it, following Barry toward the main building. Maybe Drew was being paranoid. He headed inside to grab dinner and assess the situation. The truck stop's restaurant was typical. Vinyl booths, tired-looking waitresses, food that was edible but not memorable. Drew took a corner booth where he could watch the fuel islands through the window. Sure enough, he saw several drivers apparently having trouble with the card readers, throwing up their hands in frustration. The cashier at the register, a young woman whose name tag read Faye, looked stressed as she dealt with complaining customers. When Drew approached to pay for his meal, he decided to probe a little. "Card reader working here?" he asked. Faye nodded, running his card without issue. "Yeah, just the fuel systems that are down. Barry's handling the prepays if you need fuel." So Barry was legitimate, or at least Faye thought he was. Drew returned to his booth, but something still nagged at him. He pulled out his phone and called the truck stop's corporate customer service line. After navigating through several menu options, he reached a human. "I'm at your Lakeland location," Drew explained, "having some issues with the payment systems here." The customer service rep sounded confused. "I'm not showing any reported outages at that location, sir." "Let me check with technical support." After a brief hold, she returned. "No, sir. All systems should be fully operational at Lakeland. If you're having issues, please speak with the on-duty manager." "What's the manager's name?" Drew asked. "Let me see. That would be Margaret Wilson for the evening shift. Not Barry." Drew's instincts had been right. He hung up and observed the restaurant more carefully. Barry was back, talking to two more drivers near the entrance. One of them was pulling out his wallet, counting bills. Drew needed to warn the others, but he also needed to be smart about it. If Barry was running a scam, he might not be alone, and confronting him directly could be dangerous. Drew returned to his truck and got on his CB radio, switching to channel 19. Breaker, this is Big Country at the Sunshine State Plaza. Got a situation here, anyone copying?" Several drivers responded. Drew continued. "Fake manager running a prepay fuel scam. Guy named Barry. Don't give him any money." The CB erupted with chatter. Some drivers had already paid Barry. Others were about to. Within minutes, a small crowd of angry truckers was forming in the parking lot. Barry, sensing the shift in atmosphere, was trying to casually make his way toward a white van parked near the exit. "That's him!" shouted one driver who'd given Barry $300 for supposed prepaid fuel. "Don't let him leave." Barry broke into a run, but truckers aren't easy to outmaneuver in a parking lot they know well. Two drivers cut him off near the van, and Barry found himself surrounded by increasingly angry men who'd realized they'd been scammed. "Where's our money?" demanded a burly driver with Arkansas plates. Barry tried to maintain his act. "There's been a misunderstanding. I work here. Check with Faye at the register." But Drew had already thought of that. "Called corporate? Evening manager's Margaret Wilson, not you, and the payment systems are working fine." Barry's confident demeanor cracked. He reached for his pocket, and several drivers tensed, thinking he might have a weapon. But he pulled out a phone instead. "I'm calling the police." "Good," Drew said. "Save us the trouble." But Barry wasn't calling 911. Drew could hear him talking rapidly to someone, mentioning the truck stop and saying something about blown cover. Within moments, two more men emerged from the white van. They were bigger than Barry, meaner looking, and one had his hand inside his jacket in a way that suggested a weapon. The situation was escalating toward violence when the actual truck stop manager, Margaret Wilson, came outside to investigate the commotion. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who took one look at Barry and his associates and immediately called the real police. "I don't know who you are," she announced loudly, "but you don't work here." "Everyone stay calm. Police are on the way." Barry's associates were evaluating their options, clearly calculating whether they could fight their way out. The truckers, for their part, were forming a loose circle, not attacking but not backing down either. It was a tense standoff that could explode at any moment. Drew, trying to defuse the situation, addressed Barry's accomplices. "You've got two choices. Wait for the cops and explain yourselves, or try to fight your way through 20 angry truckers. What's it going to be?" The sound of approaching sirens made the decision for them. Barry and his associates surrendered without a fight, knowing they were outnumbered and that violence would only add to their charges. The Polk County Sheriff's deputies arrived in force, taking all three men into custody. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the scam. Barry's real name was Barry Fitzgerald, a career criminal with a record of fraud across 6 states. He and his crew had been hitting truck stops throughout Florida for months, using the same prepaid fuel con. They'd made tens of thousands of dollars from unsuspecting drivers. Their method was sophisticated. They'd study each truck stop, learn the staff names, schedules, and procedures. Barry would buy or steal a uniform, create a convincing name tag, and strike during shift changes when communication was poor. Faye, the cashier, had only been working there a week and didn't know all the managers yet. She'd assumed Barry was legitimate, inadvertently lending credibility to his scam. The white van contained boxes of fake uniforms from various truck stop chains, counterfeit name tags, and detailed notes about locations they'd hit or planned to hit. They'd been so successful that they'd gotten overconfident, staying too long at each location, taking too many victims. Drew had to give a detailed statement to Detective Ray Morrison of the Polk County Sheriff's Office. "You did good," the detective told him. "Most victims don't realize they've been scammed until the perpetrators are long gone. Your quick thinking prevented a lot more drivers from losing money." But Drew didn't feel like a hero. He felt angry that criminals were targeting hardworking truckers, people who couldn't afford to lose hundreds of dollars to scams. Many owner-operators operated on thin margins, and a loss like that could mean missing a truck payment or not being able to afford repairs. The trucking community responded to the incident with typical solidarity. Several companies created a fund to reimburse drivers who'd been scammed, recognizing that it could have happened to anyone. Drew contributed $100 to the fund, the amount he would have lost if he'd fallen for Barry's pitch. Word spread quickly through trucker networks. Drew's CB handle, Big Country, became known across Florida's highways. Other drivers would recognize him at truck stops and thank him for the warning that had saved them money. But Drew always reminded them that he'd almost fallen for it too. "These guys are getting smarter," he'd say. "They look legitimate, act legitimate, know all the right things to say. The only defense is to verify everything, even if it makes you look paranoid." Margaret Wilson implemented new security procedures at the Sunshine State Plaza. All employees now wore photo IDs with holographic security features. Any payment system issues were announced over the intercom with specific instructions that money should only be given to uniformed employees at designated registers, never to individuals in the parking lot. But Drew knew that criminals would adapt. They always did. The next scam would be different, more sophisticated, targeting whatever vulnerability they could find in the trucker's routine. The truck stop that should be a safe haven for rest and resupply remained a hunting ground for predators. 6 months after the Barry incident, Drew encountered another scam at a different truck stop. This time it was a fake DOT inspector demanding immediate cash payment for supposed violations. Drew recognized the con immediately, called it in, and watched another arrest. He was developing a reputation as someone criminals should avoid, but the reputation came with a cost. Drew found himself constantly suspicious, always looking for the angle, the con, the threat. Every friendly approach might be a setup, every helpful gesture potentially harmful. It was exhausting, maintaining that level of vigilance, but necessary. He started keeping a journal of scams he encountered or heard about, sharing it on trucker forums and social media. The Big Country Scam Alert became a resource for drivers nationwide. Drew documented dozens of cons: fake emergency repairs, counterfeit fuel cards, phony charity drives, staged accidents for insurance fraud. The journal revealed patterns. Scammers targeted tired drivers, those obviously far from home, owner-operators rather than company drivers. They struck during shift changes, bad weather, holidays, any time when vigilance might be reduced or authority might be questioned less. Barry Fitzgerald was convicted of fraud, theft by deception, and criminal conspiracy. He was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, though Drew knew he'd probably serve less than half that. His accomplices got lesser sentences. They'd be out soon enough, maybe running the same scams under different names in different states. During the trial, Barry's lawyer tried to paint the truckers as vigilantes who'd illegally detained his client. But security camera footage clearly showed Barry running the scam, taking money under false pretenses. The truckers had simply prevented a criminal from escaping, well within their rights as citizens. Drew testified at the trial, describing how he'd uncovered the scam. Barry stared at him throughout, his expression unreadable. After the verdict, as Barry was led away in shackles, he called out to Drew, "See you down the road, Big Country." It wasn't exactly a threat, but it wasn't friendly either. Drew knew that Barry represented thousands of criminals who saw truckers as easy marks, walking ATMs carrying cash for fuel, food, and emergencies. The battle between truckers and those who would prey on them was ongoing, with no end in sight. The Sunshine State Truck Plaza became more vigilant after the incident, but also more welcoming to drivers who'd been victims of scams elsewhere. Margaret Wilson instituted a no questions asked policy, where drivers who'd been scammed at other locations could get a free meal and shower, a small gesture of solidarity in a harsh industry. Drew continued driving, continued watching, continued warning others. His journal grew to hundreds of entries, a comprehensive guide to the dark side of truck stop life. He received emails from drivers who'd avoided scams because of his warnings, thanks that made the constant vigilance worthwhile. But he also received threats, anonymous messages from people who didn't appreciate him interfering with their business. Drew varied his routes, avoided patterns, never stayed at the same truck stop twice in a row. The very criminals he'd exposed had made him a target. One night, at a truck stop in Georgia, Drew noticed someone photographing his truck, paying special attention to his license plates and DOT numbers. When confronted, the person claimed to be a truck enthusiast, but Drew knew better. He left immediately, drove an extra 2 hours to a different stop, and reported the incident to law enforcement. The police couldn't do anything about someone taking pictures, but they added Drew's information to a watch list, agreeing to respond quickly if he called for help. It was small comfort, but better than nothing. Drew's wife worried about him constantly. "Maybe it's time to find different work," she suggested during one of his home visits. "You've done your part. Let someone else fight these battles." But Drew couldn't quit. Every time he thought about it, he'd hear from another driver who'd been scammed, another family struggling because someone had stolen their fuel money. The criminals wouldn't stop just because he did. If anything, his retirement would embolden them. So he kept driving, kept watching, kept warning. The Sunshine State Truck Plaza incident became legendary in trucker circles, the night when drivers stood together against a common threat. It proved that while truckers might drive alone, they were part of a community that would protect its own. Barry Fitzgerald was released after serving 3 years. Word spread quickly through the trucker network. He'd been spotted at truck stops in Texas, possibly running new scams. Drew added an update to his journal, including Barry's photo and known aliases. Forewarned was forearmed. The cycle continued. Criminals evolved their tactics. Truckers adapted their defenses. Law enforcement played catch-up. It was an endless game with real stakes, played out in parking lots and fuel islands across America. Drew had become an unwilling expert in this game, a guardian of sorts for his fellow drivers. His CB handle, Big Country, became synonymous with scam alerts. When drivers heard Big Country's got a warning, they listened. He'd saved countless drivers thousands of dollars, prevented who knows how many crimes. But he knew he was just one man against an ocean of predators. The truck stops themselves began consulting with Drew, asking his advice on security procedures, scam prevention, driver protection. He'd become an unpaid consultant to an industry trying to protect itself from those who would exploit it. Some stops even posted his scam alerts in their driver lounges. Drew Matheson never sought fame or recognition. He was just a trucker who'd noticed something wrong and acted on it. But his actions that night at the Sunshine State Plaza had ripple effects throughout the industry, raising awareness and vigilance among drivers who might otherwise have been victims. The war between truckers and criminals continues every night at truck stops across America. It's fought with vigilance and verification, with CB radios and cell phones, with truckers watching out for each other against those who see them as prey. Drew's story is just one battle in that war, but it's a battle that made a difference, saving money and possibly lives. Because in the end, that's what the scammers don't understand about truckers. They might drive alone, but they're never really alone. They're part of a brotherhood that transcends company rivalries and personal differences. When threatened, they stand together, protect each other, and ensure that the criminals learn a hard truth. Truckers are not easy targets, and truck stops are not free hunting grounds for predators. Shane Williams had always trusted technology. In his 7 years of driving truck through Florida, his GPS had never led him astray. The Garmin Diesel unit mounted on his dashboard was specifically designed for commercial vehicles, calculating routes based on bridge heights, weight restrictions, and hazmat regulations. So when it started malfunctioning on a foggy November night near Okeechobee, Shane's world turned upside down in ways he could never have anticipated. He was hauling a refrigerated load of seafood from Fort Pierce to a distribution center in Naples, a routine run he'd done dozens of times. The 2020 Peterbilt 389 hummed smoothly as he headed west on State Road 70, planning to catch Interstate 75 south. It was just past 11 p.m. and Shane was making good time, despite the thick fog that had rolled in from Lake Okeechobee. The first sign of trouble came when the GPS suddenly recalculated, directing him off the main highway onto County Road 721. Shane hesitated. He didn't remember this being part of his usual route. But the fog was so thick he could barely see the road signs, and the GPS had always been reliable before. Maybe there was construction ahead or an accident. The unit showed this as the fastest route, so he followed its guidance. County Road 7. 21 was narrower than Shane expected, barely wide enough for his rig. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, creating a tunnel effect that his headlights struggled to penetrate. The fog seemed even thicker here, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. Shane slowed to 30 miles per hour, uncomfortable with the conditions but trusting the GPS knew what it was doing. After 15 minutes on the county road, the GPS directed him onto an even smaller road. Unpaved, unmarked. Just a dirt track leading into what looked like wilderness. Every instinct told Shane this was wrong, but when he tried to check his position on his phone, he found no signal. The GPS showed him still en route, estimated arrival time unchanged. Shane stopped the truck, considering his options. He could try to reverse back to the county road, but the path was too narrow to turn around, and backing up in this fog would be dangerous. The GPS insisted he was only 5 miles from rejoining State Road 70. Against his better judgment, he continued forward. The dirt road grew worse, rutted and soft from recent rain. Shane could feel his truck struggling for traction, the heavy load making every bump and hole more treacherous. Tree branches scraped against his trailer, and more than once he had to stop to ensure he wasn't about to hit an overhanging limb that could damage his rig. Then he saw the lights. A small building ahead, barely visible through the fog. As he got closer, he realized it was an old gas station, the kind that had probably been abandoned since the interstate system killed the small highway towns. But the lights were on, and there was movement inside. Shane pulled into the cracked asphalt lot, relieved to find somewhere he could turn around. As he maneuvered his truck, an elderly woman emerged from the building. She was wearing a floral dress that looked decades out of style, and her hair was done up in a beehive that hadn't been fashionable since the 1960s. "You lost, honey?" she called out, her voice carrying a deep southern drawl. Shane rolled down his window. "GPS led me down here, trying to get to 75 South. This thing says I'm en route, but that can't be right." The woman's expression darkened. "That GPS nonsense? You're not the first. Had 3 truckers come through here this month, all saying the same thing. Their machines telling them to come down roads that ain't been truck routes for 40 years. "Where am I exactly?" Shane asked, feeling increasingly uneasy. "You're about 15 miles from anywhere useful," the woman replied. "My name's Iris. I run this place, such as it is. My husband Kurt's inside. We can help you figure out how to get back to the highway, but that fog ain't lifting anytime soon. Might want to wait it out." Shane checked his watch. He had 4 hours of drive time left on his electronic logs, and his delivery window was tight. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I need to keep moving." "Can you just point me in the right direction?" Iris shook her head slowly. "Honey, the road you came down is the only way in or out for a truck your size. You're gonna have to back up near 2 miles to find a place wide enough to turn around. In this fog, that's asking for trouble." The prospect of backing his 53-foot trailer down a narrow dirt road in heavy fog was daunting, but Shane didn't see alternatives. As he considered his options, a man emerged from the station, presumably Kurt. He was tall, thin, wearing overalls and a John Deere cap. Something about his expression made Shane uncomfortable, a calculating look that didn't match his friendly wave. "Iris telling you about our GPS problem?" Kurt asked, approaching Shane's truck. "Been happening more and more lately. Something about the cell towers out here. Magnetic fields from the swamp, who knows? But trucks keep ending up on our doorstep. Has anyone figured out why?" Shane asked. Kurt shrugged. "County doesn't care about roads nobody's supposed to use. Phone company says their towers are working fine. GPS companies blame user error. Meanwhile, you truckers keep getting lost out here." Shane noticed Kurt was studying his truck intently, particularly the refrigeration unit. "What you hauling, if you don't mind me asking?" "Seafood," Shane replied curtly, not liking the interest. "Expensive load, then," Kurt observed. "That reefer unit's running hard. How long you been on battery?" Shane frowned. "I'm not on battery." Running off the engine. "You sure about that?" Kurt pointed to the refrigeration unit's display panel, visible through Shane's mirror. "That light there says you're on backup power. Engine connection must have gotten knocked loose on these rough roads." Shane's blood ran cold. If the refrigeration unit was running on battery, he had maybe 2 hours before it died completely. The entire load would spoil, costing tens of thousands of dollars. He'd be liable for the loss. "I need to check that," Shane said, starting to open his door. "Careful now," Kurt said, backing away. "Lots of dangerous critters out here at night. Snakes, gators, wild boar. We had a trucker last week got bit by a cottonmouth just stepping down from his cab." Shane grabbed his flashlight and carefully climbed down, watching where he stepped. Sure enough, the refrigeration unit's power cable had partially disconnected, probably from the violent bouncing on the rutted road. But as he moved to reconnect it, he noticed something else: fresh tool marks on the connection, as if someone had deliberately loosened it. He looked up to find Kurt watching him intently. "Find the problem?" "Yeah," Shane said slowly, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. "Found it." The atmosphere changed instantly. Kurt's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by something harder. "Smart man would accept help when it's offered." "Backing out of here in this fog, that refrigeration unit might fail completely. Load like that would be a total loss." "Are you threatening me?" Shane asked, backing toward his cab. "Threatening?" Iris had joined Kurt, and her grandmotherly appearance now seemed like a calculated disguise. "We're offering to help. For a fee, of course. Call it a salvage operation. You report the load as lost, we help you dispose of it, everyone makes out." Shane understood now. This wasn't random bad luck. Somehow these people were manipulating GPS systems to lead trucks here, then creating problems they could exploit. It was extortion, plain and simple. "No deal," Shane said, climbing back into his cab and locking the doors. Kurt's face flushed with anger. "You're making a mistake, boy. That fog ain't lifting for hours. Lot can happen to a truck stuck out here. Tires go flat, fuel gets contaminated, brake lines get cut. Dangerous place, these back roads." Shane grabbed his CB radio, trying channel after channel, but getting only static. His cell phone still showed no signal. He was effectively cut off from the outside world, trapped between criminals and an impossible road. But Shane had been underestimated. While Kurt and Iris thought they had him cornered, he'd been in tough spots before. He started his engine, put the truck in reverse, and began the careful process of backing out. "You'll never make it," Kurt shouted. "That road's too narrow, too twisted. You'll jackknife for sure." Shane ignored him, focusing entirely on his mirrors, using every skill he'd developed in 7 years of driving. Inch by inch, foot by foot, he backed the massive rig down the dirt road. The fog made it nearly impossible to see, but Shane relied on instinct and experience, feeling the road through the steering wheel, listening to the engine's rhythm. Behind him, he could hear a vehicle following. Kurt and Iris, probably hoping he'd get stuck so they could force their help on him. But Shane kept going, sweating despite the cool night, muscles aching from the constant micro-adjustments required to keep the trailer aligned. It took an hour to back up 2 miles, the longest hour of Shane's life. Several times the trailer started to jackknife, and he had to pull forward and readjust. Once, the right wheel slipped off the road entirely, and for a terrifying moment he thought the truck would tip, but he managed to recover, inch by precious inch. Finally, miraculously, he reached a spot wide enough to turn around. As he completed the maneuver, he saw Kurt and Iris's pickup truck in his mirrors, stopped about 50 feet back. They knew they'd lost this round. Shane didn't stop to celebrate. He drove as fast as safely possible back to County Road 721, then to State Road 70. As soon as he had cell signal, he called 911, reporting the attempted extortion and the GPS manipulation. He also called his dispatcher. explaining the delay and the danger he'd encountered. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated criminal operation. Kurt and Iris Watson had been using a GPS spoofing device, illegal technology that could override GPS signals in a localized area. They'd lure trucks to their isolated property, create or exacerbate problems, then offer to help for a price. Some drivers paid to avoid losing their loads. Others abandoned their trucks entirely, which the Watsons would then strip for parts. Targeted refrigerated loads because the time pressure made drivers more likely to pay. At their trial, the full scope of the operation came to light. The Watsons had help from a nephew who worked at a truck stop, identifying valuable loads and planting GPS tracking devices. They'd monitor approaching trucks and activate their GPS spoofer at just the right moment to divert them. Kurt Watson was sentenced to 12 years for extortion, theft, and conspiracy. Iris got 8 years, her age and health considered. Their nephew received 5 years for his role. The gas station was seized by the state and demolished. Shane's refrigerated load arrived only 6 hours late, still fresh thanks to his quick repair of the power connection. His company commended him for protecting the cargo under extraordinary circumstances. But Shane knew he'd been lucky as much as skilled. The incident changed how he approached navigation. He now carried paper maps, had memorized alternative routes, and never blindly followed GPS directions that didn't make sense. He also invested in a satellite phone, ensuring he'd never be completely cut off again. Word of Shane's ordeal spread through the trucking community. Other drivers reported similar experiences. GPS units suddenly routing them through inappropriate areas, always in isolated locations where help was far away. It became clear the Watsons weren't the only ones using this method. The GPS manufacturers issued updates to prevent spoofing, but criminals adapted quickly. The cat-and-mouse game continued, with the truckers caught in the middle. Shane became an advocate for navigation safety, teaching other drivers to recognize the signs of GPS manipulation. Trust but verify became his motto. If your GPS tells you to turn onto a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, stop and think. Check paper maps, call dispatch, use common sense. Technology is a tool, not a master. Shane continued driving for another 5 years, always cautious, always prepared. He kept a journal of suspicious GPS behaviors, sharing it with law enforcement and fellow drivers. His experience had taught him that criminals would exploit any vulnerability, even something as seemingly benign as navigation systems. The dirt road near Okeechobee was eventually barricaded, preventing trucks from accidentally entering. But Shane knew there were dozens of similar roads throughout Florida, potential traps for unwary drivers. The swamps and forests hid many secrets, and not all of them were natural. His story became required reading in many trucking company training programs, a cautionary tale about over-reliance on technology. New drivers learned about GPS spoofing, about criminals who used isolation as a weapon, about the importance of maintaining multiple navigation methods. Shane never forgot the terror of backing down that boggy road, knowing that Kurt and Iris were behind him, waiting for him to fail. The memory kept him sharp, vigilant, ready for whatever danger the road might present. He'd learned that sometimes the greatest threat wasn't mechanical failure or bad weather, but humans who'd turned technology into a trap. Years later, retired and safe, Shane would sometimes check GPS forums and trucking websites, looking for reports of suspicious routing. When he found them, he'd reach out to the drivers, sharing his experience, warning them about the danger. He couldn't protect everyone, but he could ensure his story served as a warning. The Florida backroads remain dangerous for truckers who venture off main highways. Hidden in the fog and forest are people like the Watsons, waiting with their technological traps and criminal intentions. But thanks to drivers like Shane Williams, fewer truckers fall victim to these schemes. His successful escape proved that preparation, skill, and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal plots. The GPS in Shane's current personal vehicle is top of the line, with all the latest anti-spoofing technology. But he still carries paper maps, still memorizes routes before traveling, still maintains a healthy skepticism about any direction that doesn't feel right. Because he knows that somewhere out there, on some lonely road, someone is setting a trap, waiting for the next trucker to trust their technology too much. Shane's final message to the trucking community was simple but profound. Your GPS is just a tool. Your brain is your best navigation system. When the two disagree, trust your instincts. The life you save might be your own. The fog still rolls in from Lake Okeechobee on humid nights, obscuring roads and confusing travelers. But truckers who know Shane's story drive more carefully, trust technology less blindly, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous detour is the one that seems like a shortcut. In the end, Shane Williams didn't just escape a trap. He exposed a new kind of danger that truckers everywhere now know to watch for.